The weight of service. Dobby had always believed that freedom meant the right to choose whom to serve. On Christmas Eve, with the castle emptied of students and most of the staff gone to their families, that belief felt more fragile than the china teacup trembling in his small hands. The Hogwarts corridors echoed with a peculiar kind of silence. Not the peaceful quiet of sleep, but the hollow stillness of abandonment. Even the portraits dozed fitfully in their frames, and the ghosts had retreated to whatever corners of eternity they called home during the holidays. He climbed the spiral staircase to the headmaster's office, each step measured and deliberate. The stone gargoyle had recognized him without need for passwords. House elves were always expected, always welcome, always invisible until needed. Dobby supposed that was still a kind of freedom, even if it felt suspiciously like his old life at the Malfoys. The tea service rattled softly on his tray, the sound unnaturally loud in the empty stairwell. Professor Dumbledore's office was warm, crackling with firelight and the comfortable weight of accumulated magic. Books lined the walls in precarious towers, their spines glowing faintly with protective charms. The various silver instruments hummed and clicked to themselves, measuring things Dobby didn't pretend to understand. Behind the massive desk, Albus Dumbledore sat writing with his phoenix feather quill, his long silver beard catching the light like spun moonbeams. "Ah, Dobby." Dumbledore looked up, his blue eyes twinkling with what Dobby had once thought was kindness. Now, after months of service, he recognized it as something else. Calculation, perhaps, or the particular warmth adults reserved for useful children. "Right on time, as always. Please, set it by the fire." Dobby crossed to the small table beside the hearth, moving with the particular care that house elves learned early. Do not drop things. Do not spill. Do not make noise unless noise is required. The lessons of servitude ran deeper than freedom ever could, it seemed. He arranged the tea service with practiced precision. Cup, saucer, spoon, sugar, cream, the tiny plate of biscuits that Professor Dumbledore favored in the evening. "Will there be anything else, Professor?" Dobby asked, his voice carefully neutral. The words came automatically, the same question he had asked Lucius Malfoy 1,000 times, though the tone was softer now. Dumbledore had never raised his hand to him, never screamed or threatened, but Dobby had learned to read the silences between words, and lately those silences had grown heavier. "Actually, yes. Professor Snape will be joining me shortly. Perhaps you could prepare another cup." Dobby nodded and busied himself with the additional place setting. As he worked, he listened to the scratch of Dumbledore's quill against parchment, a sound that had become as familiar as his own breathing. The headmaster wrote constantly, letters, notes, observations. Dobby had glimpsed some of them while cleaning, correspondence with ministry officials, instructions to order members, careful records of things that made his stomach twist with unease. The fireplace flared green, and Professor Snape stepped through, brushing ash from his black robes with sharp, irritated movements. His dark eyes swept the room, cataloguing everything as they always did, before settling on Dobby with their usual mixture of dismissal and suspicion. "Headmaster," Snape said, taking his customary chair across from Dumbledore's desk. "I trust this meeting is as urgent as your message implied." "Sit, Severus. Tea?" Dumbledore gestured to the service, and Dobby stepped forward to pour. The routine was familiar, comforting in its predictability. He had served Snape tea dozens of times now, had learned exactly how the potions master liked it. Strong, no sugar, barely a splash of cream. Simple preferences that spoke of a man who had little patience for indulgence. "The boy returned to his relatives yesterday," Snape said without preamble, accepting his cup with a curt nod. "The blood wards are holding, though he grows more resistant to the placement each year." Dobby's hands stilled over the sugar bowl. The boy. They always called him the boy, as if Harry Potter had no name, no identity beyond his function in whatever grand plan they'd constructed around him. It made something cold and angry twist in Dobby's chest. "That's to be expected," Dumbledore replied, settling back in his chair with his own tea. "Adolescence is naturally rebellious. He questions more now, demands explanations I'm not yet prepared to give. Perhaps because the explanations would horrify him. Snape's voice was carefully controlled, but Dobby heard the edge beneath it. He had worked for cruel masters before. He knew the sound of conscience at war with duty. The truth would serve no one at this stage, Dumbledore said gently, the same tone he used when explaining to first years why they couldn't perform certain spells. Harry must be protected from knowledge that would only burden him unnecessarily. He's still a child, Severus. Let him remain one for as long as possible. Dobby found himself gripping the cream pitcher tighter than necessary. Harry Potter was 17, hardly a child by wizarding standards. He had already faced Voldemort multiple times, had watched friends die, had carried burdens that would have broken grown wizards. Yet somehow, in Dumbledore's careful words, he was always too young, too innocent, too fragile to be trusted with his own truth. The boy must not know yet, Snape said, and there was something bitter in his voice. How many times have we said those words, Albus? How many decisions have we made for him, about him, without him? At what point does protection become manipulation? Dumbledore was quiet for a long moment, staring into the fire with eyes that seemed older than the castle itself. When you have lived as long as I have, Severus, you learn that sometimes love requires terrible choices. Everything I have done has been for his ultimate good, including allowing him to return to that house, to those people. Snape's cup rattled against his saucer as he set it down. I have seen the memories, Albus. I know what they do to him. The blood protection? Damn the blood protection! The words came out sharp and low, barely above a whisper, but filled with a venom that made Dobby's ears twitch. You speak of love, but what love locks a child in a cupboard? What love starves and beats and tells a child he's worthless? Those muggles would have destroyed him completely if left to their devices. Dobby's hands were shaking now, the sugar spoon rattling against the bowl. He had seen Harry Potter's wrists once, thin as bird bones, had noticed how the boy sometimes flinched when adults moved too quickly. He had told himself it was war trauma, battle stress, the natural consequence of facing dark wizards. But Snape's words painted a different picture, one that made Dobby's magic burn hot and protective in his chest. The alternatives were worse, Dumbledore said quietly. Would you have had me place him with the Longbottoms, where Bellatrix might have found him? The Weasleys who could barely protect their own children. Harry needed to be hidden completely and utterly until he was strong enough to face his destiny. His destiny. Snape laughed, a sound like breaking glass. You mean the destiny you've written for him, the path you've laid out without his knowledge or consent. Severus, no, Albus. I've held my tongue for years, but I cannot continue to pretend this is anything other than what it is. You have raised that boy like a lamb for slaughter, and now you speak of love as if that word could justify what we've asked of him. Dobby's magic was crackling around him now, invisible but potent, responding to the fury that threatened to overwhelm his careful composure. Neither wizard looked at him. They never did, treating him as a piece of furniture that happened to have ears. But he was listening. Oh yes, he was listening to every terrible word. You think I don't know what this costs? Dumbledore's voice remained calm, but there was steel beneath the gentleness now. You think I don't lie awake at night wondering if there was another way? But I have seen the alternatives, Severus. I have looked into the future with every tool at my disposal, and in every timeline where Harry Potter lives a normal life, everyone dies. Everyone. The boy himself, his friends, you, me, every witch and wizard in Britain. Is his happiness worth more than all their lives? Perhaps, Snape said quietly, that should be his choice to make. The silence that followed was thick with unspoken arguments, years of moral compromises and justified cruelties. Dobby stood frozen beside the tea service, understanding with crystal clarity that he was witnessing something that would haunt him for the rest of his life. "Harry must not know," Dumbledore said again, and this time it sounded less like protection and more like a command. "Not yet. When the time comes, when he's ready, I will tell him everything. But until then, we continue as we have. It's the only way." Snape said nothing, but Dobby saw him close his eyes as if in pain. "Will that be all, Professor?" Dobby managed to ask, his voice smaller than usual. He needed to leave, needed to be anywhere but here, listening to them discuss Harry Potter's life, like it belonged to them instead of him. "Yes, thank you, Dobby. You may go." Dobby gathered the empty cups and saucers with mechanical precision, his mind racing even as his hands performed their familiar tasks. As he reached for Dumbledore's cup, he noticed that the headmaster had returned to his writing. The parchment was covered with Dumbledore's neat, slanted script, but from his angle, Dobby could only make out a few words at the top of the page. "Harry Potter, final preparations." The teacup slipped from Dobby's fingers, hitting the saucer with a sharp chink that seemed to echo in the suddenly quiet office. Both wizards looked at him, and Dobby felt heat flood his cheeks. "Forgive, Dobby," he stammered, steadying the cup with trembling hands. "Dobby is clumsy tonight." "Think nothing of it," Dumbledore said kindly, but his free hand moved almost unconsciously to cover the parchment. "Careful with the stairs, old friend. The castle settles strangely when it's this empty." Dobby nodded and backed toward the door, clutching the tea tray like a shield. He managed to make it to the spiral staircase before his composure finally cracked. Leaning against the cold stone wall, he closed his eyes and tried to steady his breathing. Final preparations. The words echoed in his mind, taking on sinister new meaning in light of everything he'd just heard. What preparations? For what end? And why did every instinct Dobby possessed scream that Harry Potter was in more danger from his supposed protectors than from his enemies? He had served cruel masters before. He knew the difference between protection and possession, between love and control. The Malfoys had been evil, yes, but they had been honestly evil. They had never dressed their cruelty in kind words or justified their abuse with talk of greater good. Lucius Malfoy had hurt him because he enjoyed it. Dumbledore hurt Harry Potter because he thought it was necessary. Dobby wasn't sure which was worse. The castle felt different as he made his way back to the kitchens, the familiar corridors seeming to whisper with secrets and half-heard confessions. He passed the great hall, empty now but for the house tables pushed against the walls, and remembered all the meals he'd helped prepare where Harry Potter sat with his friends, laughing and talking like a normal student. Had the boy known, even then, that his childhood was borrowed time? That every moment of happiness was carefully calculated, parcelled out in measured doses by people who claimed to love him? In the kitchens, Dobby set the tea service beside the great stone sinks and began washing the cups with methodical care. The work usually calmed him. The warm water, the simple motions, the satisfaction of making something clean and useful. Tonight, his hands moved without thought, while his mind churned with dangerous possibilities. He could do nothing. That was the safe choice, the expected choice. House elves did not interfere in the affairs of their betters. They served, they cleaned, they kept secrets. Dumbledore had given him work and wages and a small room of his own. He had been kinder to Dobby than any master had a right to be. But Harry Potter had set him free. Harry Potter had treated him like a person worthy of respect and gratitude. Harry Potter had been the first wizard to thank him for his service, and mean it. And Harry Potter was being led to slaughter by the people who claimed to love him most. Dobby dried the last teacup and set it carefully in its cupboard. Then he stood there in the warm kitchen, surrounded by the tools of service and the comfort of routine, and felt his world shift irrevocably around him. He had believed that freedom meant the right to choose whom to serve. Now he understood that it meant something far more dangerous, the right to choose whom to save, The castle settled around him with small creaks and sighs, and in the headmaster's office far above, Albus Dumbledore continued writing his careful plans for a boy who deserved to know the truth. Dobby closed his eyes and made a decision that would change everything. Christmas was 2 days away. Perhaps it was time Harry Potter received a gift that actually belonged to him. The truth about his own life. The kitchen fire crackled softly, and Dobby began to plan. Above him, the school slept on, unaware that its most overlooked resident had just declared war on its most beloved leader. In the morning, the sun would rise on what looked like another quiet winter day at Hogwarts. But appearances, Dobby had learned, were almost always lies, and he was tired of living in a world built on lies told by good people who had forgotten that even the best intentions could not justify the worst betrayals. He had work to do. Midnight discoveries. The castle kept its own time after midnight. Dobby had learned this during his months of service, how the ancient stones breathed differently in the deep hours, how the magic that ran through Hogwarts' foundations pulsed slower, dreamier, like a great sleeping heart. The portraits dozed more deeply, their painted eyes sealed behind heavy lids. The suits of armor stood motionless as true metal, and even the stairs seemed reluctant to shift and change their configurations. It was the perfect time for a house elf to move unseen through places where house elves were not supposed to go. Dobby stood before the gargoyle that guarded the entrance to Dumbledore's private quarters, his small hands pressed flat against the cold stone. The creature's carved eyes stared down at him with blind malevolence. But Dobby felt no fear. House elf magic was older than wizard passwords, deeper than their clever charms and protective enchantments. It flowed through the castle's bones, woven into the very foundation by elves who had labored here centuries before Hogwarts was even dreamed. He closed his eyes and let his magic seep into the stone, feeling for the mechanisms that held the entrance sealed. There, a complex web of charms and counter-charms, layered like sedimentary rock, each spell building upon the last. Impressive work, the kind that would stop any wizard who lacked the proper words. But to Dobby, it was merely a puzzle, and house elves had been solving wizard puzzles since the first magical contract was signed. The gargoyle's eyes flickered once, a brief flash of awareness, then went dark again. The wall split silently, revealing the spiral staircase beyond. Dobby's heart hammered against his ribs as he climbed. Each step felt like a small betrayal, another thread severed in the web of loyalty that had defined his existence. But the memory of that parchment, Harry Potter, final preparations, burned in his mind like a brand. He had to know. Whatever it cost him, whatever punishment awaited, he had to understand what fate was being prepared for the boy who had given him freedom. The door to Dumbledore's private quarters was warded even more heavily than the entrance below. Dobby could feel the magic pressing against him like a physical weight, spells designed to repel intruders, to alert the owner, to cause pain and disorientation to anyone who dared trespass. But again, they were wizard spells, created with wizard assumptions about how magic worked and who might try to circumvent them. House elves were invisible to such protections, not because they lacked magical power, but because wizards consistently failed to account for magic that didn't flow through wands and formal incantations. Dobby pressed his palm against the door and felt the wards part before him like water, recognizing him as part of the castle's natural order, a servant going about his duties. The lock clicked open with barely a whisper. Dumbledore's private study was smaller than his office, but somehow felt more intimate, more revealing. The walls were lined with books, not the public collection of magical texts and reference works that filled the office, but personal volumes, journals, and grimoires that spoke of a lifetime spent accumulating secrets. A fire burned low in the grate, casting dancing shadows across Persian rugs and comfortable armchairs arranged around a small table laden with half-finished correspondence. But it was the desk that drew Dobby's attention, a massive oak affair covered with neat stacks of parchment, bottles of ink in various colours, and what looked like decades of careful record-keeping. Everything was precisely organised, labelled, and dated with the methodical care of a man who understood that information was power. Dobby moved carefully among the papers, his large eyes scanning documents that made his stomach clench with growing unease. Letters to ministry officials discussing the Potter situation, correspondence with members of something called the Order of the Phoenix, outlining strategies for Harry's protection that sounded more like surveillance. Medical reports from Madame Pomfrey, detailing injuries that were never adequately explained, patterns of malnutrition, and stress that painted a picture of systematic neglect. But these were just the visible papers, the ones left out in the open where a careful observer might glimpse them. Dobby's instincts, honed by years of navigating the dangerous currents of powerful households, told him that the real secrets lay hidden deeper. He began opening drawers, his house-elf magic making quick work of the locking charms that protected each compartment. The first held financial records, payments made to various parties, including what looked like regular stipends sent to number 4, Privet Drive. Dobby stared at the figures, his mind struggling to process what he was seeing. Money. Dumbledore had been paying the Dursleys to keep Harry Potter, not just asking them to house him out of family obligation, but compensating them for the inconvenience, which meant they knew Harry had value. They knew he was important, worth something to someone, and they had chosen to treat him like a burden anyway. The second drawer contained maps and charts, detailed layouts of little whinging with various properties marked in different colours, safe houses, observation points, guard rotations. Harry Potter hadn't just been placed with his relatives, he'd been under constant surveillance, his every movement monitored and recorded by people who claimed to care about his well-being. The third drawer was locked with magic that made Dobby's skin burn when he touched it, protection spells so vicious and personal that they could only have been cast by Dumbledore himself. But house-elf magic was subtle, patient. Dobby let his power seep into the wood grain, following the natural patterns until he found the weak points where the spells anchored themselves. It took nearly 10 minutes of careful work, but eventually the drawer slid open to reveal its treasure. A leather-bound journal, thick with years of entries, its cover worn smooth by countless hours of handling. No title marked it, no name or identification, just dark brown leather and brass fittings that gleamed dully in the firelight. Dobby lifted it with trembling hands, feeling the weight of accumulated secrets. The cover fell open to reveal Dumbledore's familiar handwriting, but not the careful, measured script he used for official correspondence. This was more personal, more hurried, the private thoughts of a man who never expected anyone else to read them. The first entry was dated 17 years ago, just days after Harry Potter's parents had died. The boy has been placed with Petunia Dursley as planned. The blood protection is strong, stronger than I dared hope. Lily's sacrifice created a ward more powerful than any magic I could have woven, but it requires specific conditions to maintain its strength. The child must call the house home, must be dependent upon his mother's blood for shelter and safety. This necessitates certain uncomfortable arrangements. I have spoken with the Dursleys. Vernon is brutish but predictable. He fears magic and wishes to have nothing to do with our world. This works in our favour. The less they understand about Harry's importance, the more likely they are to treat him as the burden they believe him to be. Petunia still harbours resentment over her sister's abilities, resentment that will ensure she shows the boy no special favour. It troubles me to place him in such circumstances, but the alternatives are worse. The Longbottoms would have loved him as their own, but they are too close to the war, too visible to Voldemort's remaining followers. The Weasleys have 7 children already, and lack the resources to adequately protect another, and the boy must suffer, to some degree. Hardship builds character, creates the kind of strength he will need for what lies ahead. I have arranged for monitoring, of course. Mrs. Figg will watch from nearby, and I have other assets in place. But I will not intervene unless the situation becomes truly dangerous. The boy needs to develop independence, resilience, the kind of moral flexibility that comes from navigating difficult circumstances without adult guidance. These are not pleasant necessities, but they are necessities nonetheless. Dobby's hands shook as he read, each word hitting him like a physical blow. Dumbledore had known. He had known exactly what kind of people the Dursleys were, had counted on their cruelty to shape Harry Potter according to some grand design. The boy's suffering hadn't been an unfortunate side effect. It had been deliberate. He turned the page, skipping ahead through entries that detailed Harry's early years. Reports from Mrs. Figg about bruises and locked doors, about a child who spoke little and flinched when adults raised their voices, medical notations about malnutrition and its effects on magical development, philosophical musings about the balance between protection and preparation. Year 3. Harry shows signs of accidental magic when distressed, which is encouraging. The suppression he experiences at home creates pressure that manifests in small magical outbursts. Nothing dangerous, but evidence that his power continues to grow despite the hostile environment. Perhaps because of it, adversity shapes young wizards more effectively than comfort. I have increased the financial incentives to the Dursleys, but with careful instructions that the money is not to be spent on Harry's behalf. They are to treat him as a charity case, a burden they bear out of reluctant duty rather than love. This maintains the necessary emotional distance while ensuring they do not simply abandon him. Mrs. Figg reports that the boy has grown thin and withdrawn, speaking little except when spoken to. Some might call this concerning, but I see it as evidence of developing self-reliance. He is learning to depend only on himself, to find strength in isolation. These are valuable lessons for what lies ahead. Year after year, entry after entry, the pattern continued. Harry's childhood reduced to clinical observations and strategic calculations. Every moment of pain catalogued and justified, every instance of neglect reframed as character development. Dobby felt sick, his magic crackling around him in angry spurts that made the candles flicker and the papers rustle. But worse was yet to come. Year 11. After the events at Hogwarts, Harry's first year has exceeded all expectations. His encounter with Quirrell/Voldemort provided valuable data about the connection between them. The scar is more than merely a physical mark. It contains a fragment of Voldemort's soul, making Harry himself an accidental Horcrux. This explains the boy's ability to speak Parseltongue, his emotional connection to Voldemort's thoughts and feelings. This development is both terrible and providential. Terrible because it means Harry carries a piece of the Dark Lord within him, that his very existence is tied to Voldemort's survival. Providential because it provides the key to Voldemort's ultimate defeat. I have consulted every text on Horcruxes in existence, explored every possible avenue for their destruction. The conclusion is inescapable. As long as the soul fragment remains within Harry, Voldemort cannot truly die. And as long as Voldemort lives, the soul fragment cannot be removed without killing its host. There is only one solution, though it grieves me to acknowledge it. Harry Potter must die. Not immediately, of course. He has years of growth ahead of him, skills to develop and knowledge to acquire. But when the time comes, when Voldemort is weakened and vulnerable, Harry must be willing to sacrifice himself to destroy the Horcrux within him. It is the only way to ensure the Dark Lord's final defeat. This knowledge must be carefully managed. Harry cannot learn the truth too early, or he might despair and abandon his responsibilities. Nor can he learn too late, or he might resist when the moment comes. The revelation must be timed perfectly, delivered with just enough hope to make the sacrifice seem heroic rather than inevitable. I find myself in the position of raising a child to die willingly for the greater good. It is perhaps the most difficult task I have ever undertaken, and certainly the most morally complex. But the needs of the many must outweigh the needs of the one, even when the one is as precious as Harry Potter. Dobby dropped the journal as if it had burst into flames. The leather-bound book hit the desk with a soft thud, pages fluttering open to reveal more entries, more careful documentation of Harry Potter's planned destruction. The room seemed to spin around him, the comfortable study transforming into something nightmarish and grotesque. Harry Potter was going to die. Not in battle, not defending his friends or fighting for justice, but as a calculated sacrifice in Dumbledore's grand strategy. Everything, the placement with the Dursleys, the careful isolation, the emotional manipulation, had been designed to create a boy who would walk willingly to his own execution when the time came. And Harry had no idea. Dobby's magic exploded outward in a burst of rage and grief that extinguished every candle in the room and sent papers flying in all directions. The fire in the grate roared higher, fed by his anger, and somewhere in the castle an owl shrieked in alarm. He pressed his hands to his mouth to stifle the wail that threatened to escape him, the sound of a heart breaking under the weight of terrible knowledge. How many times had he served tea while they discussed Harry's fate? How many conversations had he witnessed where they spoke of the boy's future, knowing it held only death? The kindness in Dumbledore's voice when he mentioned Harry, the gentle concern that Dobby had admired, all of it false, all of it part of an elaborate performance designed to maintain the illusion of care while orchestrating a child's destruction. With shaking hands, he picked up the journal again, forcing himself to read more. The entries grew more detailed as Harry's school years progressed, documenting each crisis and triumph, analyzing how each experience shaped the boy's character and prepared him for his ultimate fate. The Chamber of Secrets incident was praised as valuable training in facing mortal peril. The Triwizard Tournament was noted as an important lesson in being manipulated by forces beyond his control. Even Harry's friendship with Ron and Hermione was discussed in terms of how it would motivate his final sacrifice. Year 15. After Sirius Black's death. Harry's emotional state following his godfather's death is exactly what we need to cultivate. The guilt, the rage, the desperate desire to protect his remaining loved ones. These feelings will be crucial when the time comes for him to make his final choice. He must believe that his death will save his friends, that his sacrifice has meaning beyond mere necessity. I have been careful to maintain some emotional distance from the boy, despite my natural inclination to provide comfort. He must not become too attached to me, must not rely too heavily on my approval and affection. When the moment comes, he needs to make his decision based on principle rather than personal loyalty. A boy who dies for love of his friends is a hero. A boy who dies to please his mentor is merely tragic. Severus continues to express doubts about our course of action, but his guilt over Lily's death ensures his cooperation. I have been careful to cultivate his sense of responsibility for Harry's welfare, while never fully explaining the ultimate goal. He believes he is helping to protect the boy, not preparing him for sacrifice. This cognitive dissonance serves our purposes well. Severus's genuine care for Harry's immediate safety adds credibility to the pretense that the boy has a future beyond this war. Dobby closed the journal with a sharp snap, unable to read any more. The room felt suffocating, thick with the weight of accumulated lies and calculated cruelties. He sat in Dumbledore's chair, the leather journal heavy in his lap, and tried to process what he had learned. Harry Potter, kind, brave Harry Potter, who had freed Dobby from slavery and treated him like a person worthy of respect, was being groomed for death by the very people who claimed to love him. His entire life had been a carefully orchestrated tragedy, every relationship managed, every experience calculated to produce the desired result. And the most horrifying part was how well it was working. Dobby had seen Harry in the months before he left for the Dursleys, had watched him interact with his friends and teachers. The boy was kind, but isolated, brave but burdened with guilt, fiercely protective of others while careless with his own safety. Exactly the kind of person who would choose death if he believed it would save those he cared about. Dumbledore was creating a willing martyr, and Harry had no idea. The fire in the grate had died down to glowing embers, and the study was growing cold. Dobby sat in the gathering darkness, holding a book full of secrets that could destroy the most respected wizard in magical Britain. The smart thing, the safe thing, would be to put the journal back exactly where he'd found it, lock the drawer, and pretend he'd never been there. House elves who interfered in the affairs of their betters rarely lived to regret it. But Harry Potter had never treated Dobby like a servant. From their first meeting, he had spoken to him with respect, had defended his right to freedom, had risked his own safety to help a house elf he barely knew. Harry Potter had seen Dobby as a person, not a thing, and now Dobby understood that no one else in the boy's life had offered him the same courtesy. They all saw Harry Potter as a tool, a weapon, a necessary sacrifice. Even those who loved him seemed to love what he represented more than who he actually was. Except maybe for his friends. Ron and Hermione, at least, seemed to care about Harry himself rather than his destiny. But they were children, too, manipulated in their own ways, guided toward relationships and loyalties that served Dumbledore's greater purpose. Dobby stood up, clutching the journal to his chest. The decision crystallized in his mind with perfect clarity, as sharp and unmistakable as broken glass. He had wondered what freedom truly meant, what it required of him. Now he knew. Freedom meant the responsibility to act when action was needed, even when, especially when, it went against the wishes of those in power. Freedom meant choosing loyalty based on character rather than authority. And freedom meant that sometimes the only way to serve someone you cared about was to betray someone you feared. Harry Potter deserved to know the truth about his life. He deserved the chance to make his own choices, to find his own path, to decide for himself whether Dumbledore's grand plan was worth the price being asked of him. He deserved what Dobby himself had been given, the gift of agency, the right to self-determination, even if that gift came wrapped in pain. Dobby tucked the journal inside his tea towel, the leather binding hidden against his thin chest. He would take it to Harry Potter on Christmas morning, would place it in the boy's hands, and watch as 17 years of lies crumbled into dust. It would hurt. Merlin, how it would hurt. But pain was sometimes the price of truth. He moved through the study, carefully returning everything to its proper place, erasing all evidence of his presence. The protective wards recognized him as part of the castle's natural order and sealed themselves behind him without protest. By the time he reached the gargoyle, it was as if he had never been there at all. But the journal remained pressed against his chest, warm with stolen secrets and terrible revelations. As he descended the spiral staircase, Dobby felt the weight of destiny shifting around him. Tomorrow was Christmas Eve. The day after, Harry Potter's world would change forever. The castle settled back into its midnight rhythms, ancient stones breathing their slow, eternal song. In his private study, Albus Dumbledore's empty chair sat in darkness, keeping watch over a collection of lies that would soon be exposed to light. And in the depths of Hogwarts, a free elf carried the most dangerous gift of all, the truth about a boy who deserved so much better than the adults who claimed to love him. Christmas was coming, and with it, the end of comfortable deceptions. Dobby smiled grimly as he made his way back to the kitchens. Harry Potter had given him freedom. Now it was time to return the favor. Christmas morning gift. Harry Potter woke on Christmas morning to the sound of the Dursleys laughing downstairs. It was not a sound he associated with holidays, or with much of anything, really. The Dursleys were not naturally given to laughter, at least not the kind that held warmth or genuine joy. Their amusement was usually sharp-edged, pointed at someone else's expense. Harry lay in his small bed in what had once been Dudley's second bedroom, listening to the distant sounds of a family celebrating Christmas, and tried not to think about how completely separate he was from it all. The room felt smaller each time he returned from Hogwarts, as if the walls were slowly creeping inward. Or perhaps it was that he was growing larger, his 17-year-old frame feeling increasingly ridiculous, folded into a space that had been cramped even when he was 11. The single bed was too short now, his feet hanging off the end, and the desk was so cluttered with his cousin's abandoned toys that there was barely room for his school books. Not that it mattered. He wouldn't be doing homework today anyway. Christmas was the one day of the year when even Vernon Dursley seemed to forget that Harry existed, too distracted by his own gluttony and greed to remember the unwanted nephew upstairs. It was, Harry had learned, both a blessing and a curse. Freedom from his uncle's attention, but also the crushing reminder that he was utterly alone in a house full of people who were supposed to be his family. Downstairs, Dudley squealed with delight over some expensive gift, his voice pitched high with excitement despite being nearly 18. Harry closed his eyes and tried to imagine what it would feel like to be that excited about anything, to have someone who cared enough to wrap presents with his happiness in mind. The closest he'd come was the Weasley jumpers, but even those felt tainted now, weighted with the knowledge that his friendship with Ron had been guided and encouraged by adults with their own agendas. Everything felt tainted lately. The euphoria of finishing his 6th year at Hogwarts had faded quickly once he'd returned to Privet Drive. The familiar routine of isolation and neglect had settled over him like a heavy blanket, smothering the sense of purpose and belonging he'd found in Dumbledore's lessons about Voldemort's past. Here, in this house that smelled of cleaning products and resentment, it was hard to remember that he was supposed to be important, that the fate of the wizarding world might rest on his shoulders. Here, he was just the unwanted boy in the cupboard, grown too large for his cage. A sharp crack from outside his window made Harry sit up, his hand automatically reaching for the wand hidden beneath his pillow. The sound was wrong for the suburban morning. Too sudden, too magical. His heart rate spiked as he scanned the street visible through his window, looking for signs of danger. Death Eaters, maybe, or Ministry officials come to drag him away for some violation of the underage magic laws. But the street was empty except for a few early morning joggers and a neighbor walking his dog. Harry was about to lie back down when another crack echoed through his room, this one definitely inside. "Harry Potter, sir." Harry spun around to find Dobby standing beside his bed, the house elf's large green eyes bright with nervous energy. He was holding something wrapped in brown paper and string, clutched against his chest like it was simultaneously precious and dangerous. "Dobby." Harry's voice came out rougher than he'd intended, still thick with sleep and surprise. "What are you doing here? How did you get past the wards?" The question was automatic, born of years of being told that Privet Drive was the safest place in the magical world for him. But even as he asked it, Harry realized he didn't really care about the answer. The sight of Dobby, loyal, brave Dobby, who had always treated him with genuine respect, was like a lifeline thrown to a drowning man. "House elf magic is different, Harry Potter," Dobby said, his voice quieter than usual. "The protections here, they do not see Dobby as a threat. They see a servant, and servants must be allowed to go where their duties take them." There was something odd in Dobby's tone, a weight that Harry had never heard before. The elf looked older somehow, as if he'd aged years in the months since Harry had last seen him. His usual nervous energy was still there, but underneath it was something that looked almost like resolve. "Is everything all right?" Harry asked, swinging his legs out of bed. "Has something happened at Hogwarts?" "Harry Potter must sit," Dobby said, gesturing toward the bed with one small hand. "Dobby has something to give Harry Potter, but first, Harry Potter must promise to listen. Must promise not to be angry with Dobby for what Dobby has done." Harry frowned, his instincts prickling with unease. In his experience, conversations that began with requests not to be angry rarely ended well. But this was Dobby, who had risked his life more than once to protect Harry, who had never asked for anything in return, except the chance to serve freely. "All right," Harry said, settling back onto the bed. "I promise to listen. But Dobby, you're starting to worry me. What's going on?" Dobby clutched the wrapped package tighter, his knuckles going white against the brown paper. For a moment, he looked like he might change his mind, might disapparate back to wherever he'd come from and leave Harry with his questions unanswered. Then his jaw set with determination, and he stepped forward. "Dobby has been working at Hogwarts for many months now," he began, his voice carefully measured. "Dobby serves in the kitchens, helps with the cleaning, does the work that house elves have always done. Professor Dumbledore, he pays Dobby wages and gives Dobby time off, just as Harry Potter said a free elf should have." Harry nodded, remembering his conversation with Hermione about elf rights and fair treatment. It had been one of the few things they'd agreed on completely, the need to improve conditions for magical beings who had been enslaved for centuries. "But working at Hogwarts," Dobby continued, "Dobby hears things, sees things. Things about Harry Potter that make Dobby's stomach hurt with worry." "What kind of things?" Harry asked, though part of him didn't want to know. There was something in Dobby's expression, a mixture of grief and determination, that suggested whatever he'd learned was not something Harry would want to hear. "Dobby serves tea," Dobby said simply. "Dobby cleans offices. Dobby works in places where important wizards speak of important things, and sometimes they forget that house elves have ears." Harry felt a chill run down his spine. "Dobby, what did you hear?" Instead of answering directly, Dobby held out the wrapped package. "Dobby has brought Harry Potter a Christmas present," he said, his voice shaking slightly. "But it is not the kind of present that brings happiness. It is the kind of present that hurts to receive, but hurts worse not to have." Harry stared at the package, his mind racing. "What is it?" "The truth," Dobby whispered. "The truth about Harry Potter's life. The truth about the people who claim to protect him. The truth about what they have planned for Harry Potter's future." The words fell between them, like stones dropped into still water, sending ripples of unease through Harry's chest. He reached for the package with hands that weren't quite steady, his fingers brushing against Dobby's as he took it. "Dobby," Harry said carefully, "where did this come from?" "From Professor Dumbledore's private study," Dobby admitted, his voice barely audible. "Dobby stole it, Harry Potter. Dobby broke into places where Dobby was not supposed to go, and Dobby took something that did not belong to him. Dobby has never done such a thing before, not even when the Malfoys were cruel to him." Harry's eyes widened. "You stole from Dumbledore?" "Yes," Dobby said, and there were tears streaming down his cheeks now. "Dobby stole from the wizard who gave him work and wages and kindness. Dobby betrayed Professor Dumbledore's trust, and Dobby knows it is wrong. But Harry Potter," his voice cracked, "Harry Potter, Dobby could not let them do this to you, could not let them lie to you anymore." The package felt heavier in Harry's hands, weighted with implications he didn't want to consider. "Dobby, what are you talking about? What lies? Read," Dobby pleaded, pointing at the wrapped object. "Please, Harry Potter. Read what Professor Dumbledore has written about you, about your life, about what he plans for your future. And then Harry Potter will understand why Dobby had to steal it." Harry's mouth felt dry as sand. "I don't understand. Professor Dumbledore has been nothing but kind to me. He's taught me about Voldemort, helped me understand what Professor Dumbledore wanted Harry Potter to understand," Dobby interrupted, his voice stronger now. "But not everything. Not the whole truth. Harry Potter, please. Dobby knows this is frightening, but you must read what Dobby has brought you." With shaking fingers, Harry began to unwrap the package. The brown paper fell away to reveal a leather-bound journal, its cover worn smooth by years of handling. There was no title or name on the cover, nothing to identify its contents except the weight of accumulated secrets that seemed to emanate from its pages. "This is Dumbledore's journal?" Harry asked, though he already knew the answer. "His private journal," Dobby confirmed. The one he keeps hidden behind protections and wards, the one where he writes his true thoughts, the thoughts he does not share with anyone else. Harry opened the cover, revealing pages and pages of Dumbledore's familiar handwriting. But this wasn't the careful, measured script he was used to seeing in official letters or notes left on his desk. This was more personal, more hurried, the private thoughts of a man who never expected anyone else to read them. The first entry was dated 17 years ago, just after his parents' death. Harry's breath caught as he read the opening lines, the words hitting him like physical blows. The clinical discussion of his placement with the Dursleys, the casual acknowledgement of their cruelty, the calculated decision to let him suffer for the sake of character development. "This can't be real," Harry whispered, looking up at Dobby with desperate hope. "This has to be some kind of mistake, or a forgery, or—" "It is real," Dobby said gently. "Dobby wishes it was not. But it is real." Dobby took it from Professor Dumbledore's own desk, from his own private study. No one else could have written those words. Harry turned the page, his heart hammering against his ribs. More entries, more casual discussions of his suffering, as if it were a necessary ingredient in some grand recipe. Financial arrangements with the Dursleys, instructions to various watchers, philosophical musings about the balance between protection and preparation. "He knew," Harry said, his voice hollow with shock. "He knew what they were doing to me, and he let it happen. He wanted it to happen." "Yes," Dobby whispered. Professor Dumbledore believed that Harry Potter needed to suffer to become strong, needed to be alone to become independent, needed to be hurt to become brave. Harry flipped through more pages, his eyes scanning entry after entry that reduced his childhood to strategic calculations and clinical observations. Every moment of pain catalogued and justified, every instance of neglect reframed as character development. "But why?" Harry asked, though he wasn't sure he was ready for the answer. "Why would he do this to me? I trusted him. I looked up to him. I thought he cared about me." "Keep reading," Dobby said softly. "The answer is there, but Harry Potter will not like it." Harry continued turning pages, skipping ahead through his early years at Hogwarts. He found entries about the Philosopher's Stone, about the Chamber of Secrets, about each crisis he'd faced being analysed and discussed as if they were experiments rather than life-or-death struggles. Then he reached an entry from after his first year, and the world seemed to tilt sideways. Harry's encounter with Quirrell/Voldemort provided valuable data about the connection between them. The scar is more than merely a physical mark. It contains a fragment of Voldemort's soul, making Harry himself an accidental Horcrux. Harry's hands began to shake violently. "A Horcrux," he whispered. "I'm a Horcrux." "Harry Potter knows about Horcruxes?" Dobby asked, his eyes wide with concern. "Dumbledore's been teaching me about them," Harry said numbly, "about how Voldemort split his soul to achieve immortality. But he never told me." His voice trailed off as the full implications hit him. "If I'm a Horcrux, then as long as I'm alive, Voldemort can't be completely destroyed." "Keep reading," Dobby said, though his voice was thick with tears. "It gets worse." Harry didn't want to keep reading. Every instinct he possessed was screaming at him to close the journal, to pretend he'd never seen it, to go back to the comfortable ignorance of an hour ago. But he couldn't stop himself from turning the page, from continuing down this path toward whatever truth awaited him. There is only one solution, though it grieves me to acknowledge it. Harry Potter must die. The words seemed to burn themselves into Harry's retinas. He read them again, then again, hoping they would somehow change or reveal themselves to be a misunderstanding. But they remained stubbornly, horribly clear. "I have to die," Harry said, his voice barely above a whisper. "According to this, I have to die to defeat Voldemort." "Yes," Dobby said, and his voice was full of anguish. "But read further, Harry Potter. Read what Professor Dumbledore plans to do about that." Harry's hands were shaking so badly now that he could barely turn the pages. But he forced himself to continue, to read Dumbledore's careful analysis of how to manage the revelation, how to time it perfectly, so that Harry would be willing to sacrifice himself when the moment came. This knowledge must be carefully managed. Harry cannot learn the truth too early, or he might despair and abandon his responsibilities. Nor can he learn too late, or he might resist when the moment comes. The revelation must be timed perfectly, delivered with just enough hope to make the sacrifice seem heroic rather than inevitable. I find myself in the position of raising a child to die willingly for the greater good. Harry laughed, a sound with no humor in it whatsoever. Raising a child to die willingly, he repeated. That's what my life has been. Not protection, not preparation for victory, but preparation for death. Harry Potter, Dobby said urgently, moving closer to the bed. Dobby knows this is terrible, knows this hurts more than anything should hurt. But Harry Potter needed to know, had the right to know. Did I? Harry asked, looking up from the journal with eyes that felt too dry and too bright. Because according to this, my knowing changes nothing. I still have to die. The only difference is that now I know it's coming. The difference, Dobby said fiercely, is that now Harry Potter can choose, can decide for himself whether Professor Dumbledore's plan is the only way, whether Harry Potter's life is worth less than the lives of others, can decide whether to trust the people who have lied to him his entire life. Harry stared down at the journal, at page after page of careful manipulations and calculated cruelties. Every relationship in his life was documented here, analyzed for its usefulness in preparing him for his eventual sacrifice. His friendships with Ron and Hermione, his connection to the Weasley family, his growing respect for various teachers, all of it managed, guided, encouraged when it served Dumbledore's purposes, and discouraged when it didn't. Even you, Harry said suddenly, looking up at Dobby. Is even this conversation part of his plan? Are you here because he sent you? Because he decided it was time for me to know? No, Dobby said immediately, his voice ringing with conviction. Professor Dumbledore does not know Dobby took his journal, does not know Dobby is here. This is Dobby's choice, Harry Potter. Dobby's decision to help the wizard who freed him, who treated him like a person instead of a thing. Harry searched Dobby's face, looking for any sign of deception. But all he saw was genuine concern, genuine loyalty, and genuine grief over what he'd been forced to reveal. Why? Harry asked. Why risk everything to tell me this? You could have just left the journal where it was, pretended you never saw it. You could have had a comfortable life at Hogwarts, serving a master who treats you well. Because Harry Potter deserves better, Dobby said simply. Deserves to know the truth about his own life. Deserves the chance to make his own choices instead of having them made for him. Harry Potter gave Dobby freedom, and freedom means nothing if it is not shared with others who need it. Harry felt tears burning behind his eyes, the first genuine emotion he'd felt since opening the journal. Here was Dobby, a house elf who had every reason to stay quiet and safe, risking everything to give Harry the gift of truth. It was the kind of loyalty and courage that Dumbledore claimed to value, but apparently only when it served his purposes. What am I supposed to do now? Harry asked. How am I supposed to go back to Hogwarts and pretend I don't know any of this? How am I supposed to sit in Dumbledore's office and listen to his lessons when I know he's just preparing me for slaughter? Dobby does not know, the elf admitted. That is for Harry Potter to decide. But whatever Harry Potter chooses, he will not have to choose alone. Dobby will help if Harry Potter wants Dobby's help. Harry looked down at the journal again, at 17 years of lies and manipulations laid bare in Dumbledore's own hand. The comfortable world he'd inhabited just an hour ago was gone forever, shattered by truths too devastating to ignore. But for the first time in his life, he understood exactly where he stood. No more wondering why things happened to him, no more confusion about the adults who claimed to protect him. The truth was ugly and painful, but it was his truth, and that made it precious in a way that Dumbledore's careful lies had never been. "Thank you," Harry said quietly, looking up at Dobby through eyes that were bright with unshed tears. "Thank you for trusting me with this, for believing I deserved to know." "Harry Potter has always deserved to know," Dobby said firmly, "has always deserved better than what they gave him. And now, maybe, Harry Potter can find a way to take what he deserves instead of accepting what they offer." Harry nodded, closing the journal with a soft snap. Outside his window, the Dursleys were still laughing downstairs, still celebrating their Christmas morning, as if the world hadn't just fundamentally changed. But up in his small room, holding stolen truth in his hands, Harry Potter began to plan his own kind of revolution. The boy who lived had just learned that he was meant to die. Now it was time to decide whether that fate was as inevitable as everyone seemed to think. Dobby watched him with eyes full of hope and grief, and Harry realized that for the first time in his life, someone was looking at him and seeing Harry Potter, the person rather than Harry Potter, the symbol. It was the best Christmas gift he'd ever received, even if it was wrapped in the worst kind of pain. "Stay," Harry said, as Dobby began to move toward the window. "Please, I don't want to be alone with this right now." Dobby nodded and settled himself in the desk chair, his large eyes never leaving Harry's face. Outside, Christmas morning continued, full of joy and laughter, and the comfortable lies that families told themselves. Inside, two unlikely allies sat in silence, united by the terrible gift of truth and the dawning understanding that sometimes the most loving thing you could do for someone was to shatter their world completely. Harry Potter's childhood was finally, officially over. What came next would be entirely his choice. Shattered illusions. The silence in Harry's small bedroom stretched like a held breath, heavy with the weight of revelations that couldn't be taken back. He sat on his narrow bed, Dumbledore's journal open in his lap, staring down at handwriting that had once represented wisdom and guidance, but now looked like the careful notations of a researcher documenting an experiment. An experiment with Harry Potter as the subject. Dobby remained in the desk chair, his large eyes fixed on Harry's face with an expression of careful concern. The house elf hadn't spoken since Harry had read the entry about his planned death, seemingly understanding that words would only intrude on the catastrophic reshaping of Harry's understanding of his own life. But Harry couldn't stay silent forever. The thoughts churning in his mind demanded voice, demanded acknowledgement, demanded the kind of raw honesty that he'd never been allowed to express in Dumbledore's presence. "He arranged everything," Harry said finally, his voice flat with shock. "Every single thing that's ever happened to me, he either caused or allowed or manipulated to serve his purpose." He turned a page, his movements mechanical, and found an entry dated from just before his first year at Hogwarts. The handwriting was neater here, more controlled, as if Dumbledore had taken special care with these particular words. Harry's introduction to our world must be carefully managed. He has lived with Muggles for 10 years, developing the kind of humility and wonder that will serve him well. His first glimpse of magical society should reinforce his sense of belonging, while simultaneously highlighting his unique position. "I have arranged for Hagrid to collect him from Privet Drive and escort him to Diagon Alley. Hagrid's genuine affection for the boy will provide emotional warmth, while his tendency toward indiscretion will ensure that Harry learns of his fame in the most impactful way possible. The shock of discovering his celebrity status, followed immediately by the overwhelming nature of magical society, should create the desired sense of displacement and dependency. It is crucial that Harry feels somewhat lost during this transition. A boy who is too confident, too immediately comfortable, might resist the guidance he will need. A boy who feels overwhelmed will be grateful for mentorship and direction." Harry's hands clenched around the journal's edges, the leather binding creaking under the pressure. "Even that," he whispered. "Even my first day in the magical world, He wanted me to feel lost and overwhelmed, so I'd be grateful for his help. Harry Potter, Dobby said gently. Perhaps Harry Potter should not read all of this at once. Perhaps— No. Harry's voice was sharp, with something that might have been desperation or determination. I need to know. All of it. I need to understand exactly how much of my life has been a lie. He flipped through more pages, skipping ahead to entries from his Hogwarts years. The handwriting became more hurried here, more personal, as if Dumbledore had been documenting events in real time rather than planning them in advance. First year. After the Philosopher's Stone incident, Harry's encounter with Professor Quirrell exceeded all expectations. His willingness to sacrifice himself to prevent Voldemort's return demonstrates exactly the kind of moral courage we will need to cultivate. More importantly, his reaction to fame and accolades was precisely what I hoped. Discomfort rather than pride, a desire to return to normalcy rather than embrace celebrity. The friendships he has formed with Mr. Weasley and Miss Granger are developing as anticipated. Ronald provides the kind of loyal, uncomplicated support that will ground Harry emotionally, while Miss Granger offers intellectual partnership and the drive for excellence that will push him to achieve his potential. Both relationships serve our purposes, while genuinely benefiting Harry's emotional development. I have spoken with Molly and Arthur Weasley about including Harry in their family activities during the summers. They believe this kindness stems from their own generous natures, of course, and that is for the best. Harry will be more receptive to their care if he believes it is freely given rather than orchestrated. Harry felt something cold and sharp twist in his chest. The Weasleys, warm, chaotic, wonderful Weasleys who had welcomed him into their home and their hearts, had been guided toward that kindness by Dumbledore's careful manipulation. "Ron," Harry said, his voice barely above a whisper. He guided Ron toward me, made sure we became friends. "Harry Potter," Dobby said carefully. "Perhaps Mr. Ron Weasley's friendship is real, even if it began with guidance. Perhaps— How can I know?" Harry snapped, looking up from the journal with eyes that burned with unshed tears. "How can I ever know what's real and what's been arranged for my benefit? How can I trust anything when the person I trusted most has been lying to me about everything?" He turned more pages, his movements growing frantic. Entry after entry detailed the careful management of his relationships, his experiences, his very emotional development. The Dursleys' cruelty was not just permitted, but encouraged through financial incentives. His friendship with Hermione was nurtured through careful scheduling and shared challenges. Even his conflicts with Draco Malfoy were analyzed in terms of how they helped build Harry's character and moral resolve. Second year. After the Chamber of Secrets. Harry's encounter with Tom Riddle's memory has provided invaluable insight into his connection with Voldemort. The ease with which he channeled the basilisk's venom into destroying the diary suggests that his ability to resist dark magic is stronger than I dared hope. This bodes well for the challenges that lie ahead. More concerning is his growing attachment to the school and his friends. While this emotional investment will ultimately serve our purposes, it also creates vulnerabilities that our enemies might exploit. I have arranged for additional security measures, though Harry must not be made aware of them. A boy who feels constantly guarded might rebel against the protection we provide. His friendship with Miss Weasley is developing naturally, which is fortuitous. A romantic attachment to the Weasley family will only strengthen his emotional ties to our cause. Young love often provides the most powerful motivation for self-sacrifice, as Harry's own parents demonstrated. "Ginny," Harry breathed, his voice hollow with realization. He wanted me to fall in love with Ginny because it would make me more willing to die for everyone. The journal slipped from his numb fingers, falling to the floor with a soft thud that seemed to echo in the small room. Harry stared at the wall opposite him, seeing nothing, feeling nothing except a vast emptiness where his sense of self used to be. Every choice he'd ever made, every relationship he'd ever formed, every moment of happiness or connection or belonging, all of it had been guided, encouraged, manipulated by a man who saw him not as a person, but as a weapon to be carefully forged and precisely aimed. "Harry Potter," Dobby said urgently, sliding down from the chair to approach the bed. "Harry Potter, please do not look like that. Please." "Like what?" Harry asked, his voice eerily calm. "Like Harry Potter wants to disappear," Dobby whispered. "Like Harry Potter thinks he is not real, not important, not worthy of love unless someone arranges for him to have it." The words hit Harry like physical blows, each one exposing a fear he hadn't even known he carried. "Aren't I?" he asked, looking down at Dobby with eyes that held no hope. "What part of me is real? What part of my personality, my relationships, my entire identity hasn't been shaped by his manipulations?" "All of it," Dobby said fiercely, climbing onto the bed to sit beside Harry. "Every part that matters is real. Harry Potter's kindness, real. Harry Potter's bravery, real. Harry Potter's loyalty to his friends, real. Professor Dumbledore may have arranged circumstances, may have guided situations, but he cannot create goodness where none exists. He cannot make someone brave or kind or loyal. He can only reveal what is already there." Harry wanted to believe him, wanted desperately to hold on to some sense of authentic self. But the journal lay at his feet like a confession, its pages full of calculated manipulations and strategic emotional investments. "How do you know?" Harry asked. "How can you be sure that what you see in me isn't just the result of his careful conditioning?" "Because Dobby has served cruel masters," the elf replied simply. "Has seen what happens when powerful wizards try to create loyalty through manipulation and fear. They create obedience, yes. They create compliance. But they cannot create the thing that Harry Potter gave to Dobby: respect, recognition of personhood, the understanding that even a house elf deserves dignity and choice." Harry looked at Dobby, this small creature who had risked everything to bring him the truth, and felt something warm flicker in the emptiness of his chest. "You really believe that?" "Dobby knows it," the elf said with absolute conviction. "Professor Dumbledore may have arranged for Harry Potter to meet Ron Weasley, but he did not make Harry Potter defend Dobby from the Malfoys, did not make Harry Potter trick Lucius Malfoy into freeing Dobby. That came from Harry Potter's own heart, from his own sense of right and wrong." The warmth spread, small but persistent. Harry reached for the journal again, steeling himself to read more. If he was going to understand the full scope of Dumbledore's manipulations, he needed to see all of it, no matter how much it hurt. 3rd year. After Sirius Black's exoneration, Harry's reaction to discovering his godfather's innocence has been more intense than anticipated. His joy at having a connection to his parents, combined with his fury over the injustice Sirius suffered, has created a depth of emotion that may prove challenging to manage. I have decided not to permit Sirius to take custody of Harry, despite his legal right to do so. The boy's attachment to his godfather could interfere with his willingness to accept necessary sacrifices. More importantly, Sirius's own instability and impulsiveness make him unsuitable as a guardian for someone with Harry's responsibilities. I have arranged for Sirius to remain a distant figure in Harry's life, close enough to provide emotional support, but far enough removed to avoid interfering with Harry's development. The boy needs to maintain his fundamental independence and self-reliance. "Sirius," Harry said, his voice cracking. He kept Sirius away from me. My godfather, the closest thing I had to family, and Dumbledore made sure we stayed apart, because he was afraid Sirius might interfere with his plans. Dobby made a small, pained sound. Professor Dumbledore feared that Sirius Black would put Harry Potter's happiness above Harry Potter's destiny. And he was right, Harry said bitterly. Sirius would have fought to give me a normal life. He would have tried to protect me from all of this. So Dumbledore made sure he couldn't. The next entries were even worse, documenting how Dumbledore had used Sirius's guilt over James and Lily's deaths to ensure his cooperation with the plan to keep Harry isolated. Every letter Sirius had been prevented from sending, every visit that had been discouraged, every moment of potential connection that had been carefully strangled in service of the greater good. 4th year, after the Triwizard Tournament. Harry's participation in the tournament, while unplanned, provided invaluable training opportunities. His encounters with dragons, Grindylows, and the maze's challenges have accelerated his magical development considerably. More importantly, his experience with the Imperious Curse has strengthened his natural resistance to mental manipulation. Voldemort's return, though earlier than anticipated, creates both opportunities and challenges. Harry now has a direct connection to our enemy's thoughts and emotions, which will prove useful in the battles ahead. However, this connection also makes him vulnerable to influence, which we must monitor carefully. Cedric Diggory's death has had the expected traumatic impact. Harry's guilt over the boy's fate will serve to motivate his dedication to preventing similar losses. Survivor's guilt, properly channeled, can be a powerful force for heroism. Asterisk. He's glad Cedric died, Harry whispered, his hands shaking with rage. He calls it expected traumatic impact and talks about how my guilt will motivate me to be a better weapon. The journal fell from his hands again as Harry doubled over, clutching his stomach as if he'd been punched. The casual way Dumbledore discussed Cedric's death, the clinical analysis of Harry's trauma, the complete absence of genuine sympathy or concern. It was inhuman in its coldness. "Harry Potter," Dobby said urgently, his small hands reaching out to touch Harry's shoulders. "Harry Potter, breathe, please breathe." But Harry couldn't breathe. The air in the small room felt thick and poisonous, filled with the weight of 17 years of lies and manipulations. Every memory he had of Dumbledore's kindness was now tainted. Every moment of guidance revealed as strategic positioning for an ultimate sacrifice. "I trusted him," Harry gasped between ragged breaths. "I looked up to him. I wanted to make him proud. And all along, he was just preparing me to die." "Yes," Dobby said simply, not trying to soften the truth. "But that does not mean Harry Potter must accept what Professor Dumbledore has planned. That does not mean Harry Potter must forgive what cannot be forgiven. That does not mean the plan cannot be changed." Harry looked up at Dobby through tears he hadn't realized he was crying. "How? How can I change anything when he's controlled every aspect of my life? When he's more powerful than anyone and has the entire wizarding world convinced he's some kind of saint?" "By choosing," Dobby said fiercely. "By making decisions that are Harry Potter's decisions, not Professor Dumbledore's. By trusting people who have earned trust rather than people who demand it. By remembering that Harry Potter is a person, not a weapon, no matter what anyone else believes." "But I'm still a Horcrux," Harry said, his voice breaking. "Even if I reject everything else, even if I walk away from all of it, Voldemort will still be immortal as long as I'm alive. People will still die because I'm too selfish to sacrifice myself." "Perhaps," Dobby said, "or perhaps there are other ways to solve the problem that Professor Dumbledore has not considered because he is too invested in his chosen solution. Perhaps Harry Potter, who has never been asked what he wants or what he thinks, might have ideas that no one else has explored." The idea was so foreign, so revolutionary, that Harry almost couldn't process it. For his entire life, he had been told what to do, where to go, how to respond. Even his rebellions had been carefully contained, his anger channeled in directions that ultimately served Dumbledore's purposes. The concept of actually having a say in his own fate, of being consulted about decisions that affected his life, was almost incomprehensible. "You really think there might be another way?" Harry asked. "Dobby thinks that Harry Potter is much cleverer than Professor Dumbledore gives him credit for," the elf replied. "And Dobby thinks that other people who care about Harry Potter really care, not just care about what he represents. might have ideas too. Professor Dumbledore is very wise, but he is not the only wise person in the world. And he is certainly not the only person who wants Voldemort defeated. Harry wiped his eyes with the back of his hand, feeling something that might have been hope stirring in his chest alongside the anger and grief. What do you think I should do? Dobby thinks Harry Potter should decide who to trust based on how they have treated him, not on how they claim to care about him, Dobby said. Should gather allies who see Harry Potter as a person worth protecting, not just a tool worth using. Should learn about magic and history and Horcruxes from sources that are not trying to guide him toward a predetermined conclusion. You mean, investigate on my own? Harry said slowly. Research alternatives. Question everything I've been told. Yes, Dobby said, his eyes bright with fierce loyalty. And Dobby will help. House elves have magic that wizards do not understand, access to places and information that they cannot reach. If there is another way to defeat Voldemort without Harry Potter's death, Dobby will help find it. Harry felt tears starting again, but these were different from the tears of rage and betrayal. These were tears of gratitude, of recognition, of finally understanding what it meant to have someone truly on his side. Why? He asked. Why would you do all this for me? Risk your job, your safety, your life? Because Harry Potter saw Dobby as a person when no one else did, Dobby said simply. Because Harry Potter gave Dobby choices when Dobby had never been allowed to choose. Because friendship means standing by someone when they need you, not just when it is convenient or safe. Friends, Harry repeated, the word feeling strange and wonderful on his tongue. Here, finally, was a relationship that hadn't been orchestrated or manipulated. Dobby had chosen to help him, had chosen to risk everything, not because some adult had guided him toward it, but because he believed Harry deserved better than what he'd been given. Yes, Dobby said, and his smile was radiant. Friends, real friends, who choose each other freely and honestly. Harry reached out and took Dobby's small hand in his own, feeling the warmth of genuine connection for the first time since opening the journal. Thank you, he said, for all of this, for telling me the truth, even when it hurt, for believing I deserved to know, for standing by me when everyone else sees me as expendable. Harry Potter is not expendable, Dobby said firmly. Harry Potter is precious and important and worthy of love and protection, and anyone who cannot see that doesn't deserve Harry Potter's trust or loyalty. Outside the window, the sounds of the Dursley Christmas celebration continued, a reminder of the normal world that Harry had never been allowed to fully inhabit. But inside his small room, surrounded by the wreckage of his former beliefs and the warmth of genuine friendship, Harry Potter began to plan his own kind of rebellion. The journal lay on the floor between them, its secrets exposed but no longer quite so devastating. It was still a catalogue of lies and manipulations, still proof that Harry's entire life had been orchestrated by people who saw him as a tool rather than a person. But it was also evidence that could be used, shared, leveraged to expose the truth to others who might be willing to help. I want to show this to Sirius, Harry said suddenly. And Remus. They deserve to know what Dumbledore has been doing, what he's been planning. That is a good idea, Dobby agreed, but Harry Potter should be careful about who else learns of the journal. Some people are too invested in believing Professor Dumbledore is good to accept evidence that he is not. Harry nodded, understanding the wisdom in Dobby's words. The wizarding world had elevated Dumbledore to near mythical status. Many people would refuse to believe the evidence, no matter how clear it was, would find ways to justify or rationalize his actions rather than confront the uncomfortable truth that their greatest hero was capable of terrible things. But not everyone. Sirius, who had been manipulated and controlled just as Harry had. Remus, who had been kept in the dark about so many crucial details. Maybe some of the other professors, who might have their own doubts about Dumbledore's methods. the Order members who had risked their lives for what they believed was a just cause, not knowing that their leader saw some of those lives as acceptable losses. "We'll need to be smart about it," Harry said, his mind already working through possibilities. "Careful, strategic. We'll need to gather more information, find more evidence, build a case that even Dumbledore's supporters can't ignore." "Yes," Dobby said, and there was something like pride in his voice. "That sounds like something the real Harry Potter would do. Not the Harry Potter that Professor Dumbledore tried to create, but the one who actually exists." The distinction hit Harry like a revelation. For 17 years he had been trying to live up to some ideal of what others expected him to be. The boy who lived, the chosen one, the perfect student and hero. He had measured himself against standards set by people who had their own agendas, had internalized their disappointment when he failed to meet their expectations. But those expectations had never been about him. They had been about what they needed him to be, what role they needed him to play in their plans. The real Harry Potter, the one who got angry and scared and confused, who sometimes made mistakes and sometimes chose poorly, who wanted things for himself rather than always sacrificing for others, had been treated as an inconvenience to be managed rather than a person to be respected. "I don't even know who the real me is," Harry admitted. "I've been trying to be what everyone else wanted for so long that I'm not sure what I actually want, what I actually believe." "Then Harry Potter will have to figure that out," Dobby said gently. "We'll have to spend time discovering who he is when he is free to choose. It may take time, but Dobby thinks it will be worth the effort." Harry looked around his small room, at the cramped space where he had spent so many miserable summers feeling trapped and powerless. For the first time, it didn't feel like a prison. It felt like a starting point, the place where he had finally learned the truth and begun to reclaim his own life. The Dursleys were still laughing downstairs, still celebrating their Christmas in blissful ignorance of the revolution taking place in the bedroom above them. By the time Harry returned to Hogwarts, everything would be different. He would be different. Not the compliant weapon Dumbledore had tried to forge, but something far more dangerous. A young man who knew the truth and was no longer afraid to act on it. "Dobby," Harry said, his voice steady with new resolve. "I think this is going to be the most important Christmas of my life." "Dobby thinks so too," the elf replied, and his eyes sparkled with the light of shared purpose. "And Dobby thinks that Harry Potter is ready for whatever comes next." Outside, snow began to fall, blanketing Privet Drive in clean white silence. Inside, two unlikely revolutionaries sat together in the gathering dusk, united by truth and determined to change a world that had tried to use them both. The boy who lived was done being expendable. Now it was time to discover what he might become when he chose his own path. Gathering allies. The day after Christmas dawned grey and cold, matching Harry's mood as he sat at his small desk with a piece of parchment spread before him. Writing to Sirius had never been difficult before. His godfather had always been eager to hear from him, hungry for any connection to the outside world during his years in hiding. But now, with Dumbledore's journal lying open beside him, and the weight of 17 years of manipulation pressing down on his shoulders, every word felt loaded with consequence. How did you tell someone that the person they trusted most in the world had been systematically controlling their life? How did you explain that every kindness, every gesture of care, every moment of connection had been carefully calculated to serve a larger purpose? Harry had been staring at the blank parchment for nearly an hour, his quill poised but motionless, when Dobby appeared beside him with a soft pop. "Harry Potter looks troubled," the elf observed, his large eyes studying Harry's face with concern. "I don't know how to tell him," Harry admitted, setting down his quill. "Sirius thinks Dumbledore saved his life by getting him out of Azkaban. He thinks Dumbledore is the only reason he's free. How do I tell him that Dumbledore was the one who kept us apart all these years?" "Perhaps," Dobby said carefully, Harry Potter should start with what Sirius Black already knows to be true, and work from there. Harry frowned. What do you mean? Sirius Black knows that Harry Potter was unhappy with the Dursleys, Dobby explained. Knows that Professor Dumbledore insisted Harry Potter must return there every summer. Knows that Professor Dumbledore sometimes makes decisions without explaining his reasons. These are not new ideas to him. Harry Potter would simply be providing context. The approach made sense. Sirius had always been protective of Harry, had frequently questioned why he couldn't provide a home for his godson. He had chafed against Dumbledore's restrictions, had argued for more contact and involvement. Maybe he was already prepared to hear that those restrictions had been more calculated than protective. Harry picked up his quill again and began to write. Sirius, I hope you are well and safe. I'm writing because something has happened that you need to know about. I can't explain everything in a letter. It's too important and too dangerous. But I've discovered some information about Dumbledore that changes everything. You know how you've always questioned why I had to stay with the Dursleys every summer? Why Dumbledore insisted you couldn't take custody of me? I found documentation that explains his reasoning, and it's not what you think. I need to see you as soon as possible. There are things we need to discuss that can't wait until I return to school. Can you meet me somewhere safe? Somewhere Dumbledore won't know about. This isn't a prank or teenage rebellion, Sirius. This is real, and it's important, and I need someone I can trust to help me figure out what to do next. Harry P.S. Don't mention this letter to anyone else yet. Not Remus, not anyone from the Order. Not until we've talked. Harry read the letter over twice, then sealed it and tied it to Hedwig's leg. His owl hooted softly, her amber eyes seeming to sense the importance of her mission. Take this to Sirius, Harry told her. And be careful. Don't let anyone else see you deliver it. Hedwig nipped his finger gently, her way of acknowledging a particularly serious instruction, then spread her wings and soared out into the grey morning. Harry watched until she was a distant speck against the clouded sky, then turned his attention to the more delicate task of contacting his friends. Ron and Hermione would be harder to approach than Sirius. They were still at Hogwarts, still under Dumbledore's direct influence, still surrounded by the comfortable assumptions that had shaped their magical education. More importantly, they were part of the system that had guided Harry toward this fate. According to Dumbledore's journal, their friendship with him hadn't been entirely natural. It had been encouraged, nurtured, shaped by subtle interventions and careful positioning. The question was whether that guidance had created something false, or whether it had simply allowed something real to flourish. Harry hoped desperately that it was the latter. He pulled out another piece of parchment and began composing a more cautious letter. Ron and Hermione, I hope you're both having a good Christmas. Mine has been educational. I've been doing some research into things Dumbledore taught me last year, and I've come across some information that doesn't add up. I know this might sound paranoid, but I'm starting to wonder if we're not getting the whole truth about some things. Have either of you ever noticed that Dumbledore sometimes seems to know more than he lets on? That he guides situations without explaining why? I don't want to say more in a letter, but when we get back to school, I think we need to have a serious conversation about some things. About the war, about Voldemort, about what's really expected of us. Can I trust you both to keep an open mind? To listen to what I've learned without immediately dismissing it? Harry P.S. Hermione, you always say we should question authority and think for ourselves. I think it's time we applied that philosophy to everyone, even people we respect. This letter was harder to seal. Ron and Hermione had been his closest friends for 6 years, had stood by him through dangers that would have broken most people. But they had also been shaped by the same system that had shaped him, taught by the same teachers, guided by the same assumptions about what was right and necessary. If they couldn't break free from that conditioning, if they chose loyalty to Dumbledore over loyalty to Harry, then he would truly be alone in this fight. Harry sealed the second letter and sent it off with a school owl he summoned through the window. Then he settled back to wait, knowing that the next few days would determine whether he had any real allies in the battle ahead. Dobby had remained quietly in the corner during Harry's letter-writing, but now he approached the desk with something like determination in his posture. "Harry Potter," he said, "Dobby has been thinking about what we discussed yesterday, about finding other ways to defeat Voldemort without Harry Potter's death." Harry looked up with interest. "And?" "House elves know old magic," Dobby said carefully. "Magic that wizards have forgotten or never learned. Magic that does not require wands or formal training. Dobby thinks there may be ways to destroy Horcruxes that are not in the books that Professor Dumbledore has read." "What kind of ways?" Dobby hesitated, wringing his hands. Dobby would need to research, to speak with other house elves who know the old traditions, but there are stories, legends about magic that can purify corrupted souls, that can separate dark magic from its host without destroying the host. Harry felt his heart skip. "You're saying there might be a way to remove Voldemort's soul fragment from me without killing me?" "Dobby does not know for certain," the elf said honestly. "But Dobby thinks it is worth investigating. Professor Dumbledore has focused on one solution because it is the solution he knows. But there are other kinds of magic, other traditions, other possibilities." The idea was revolutionary, so fundamentally different from everything Harry had been taught that it was hard to fully grasp. For months, he had been preparing himself mentally for a heroic death, for the sacrifice that would save everyone else. The possibility that there might be another way, that his death might not be inevitable, was almost too much to hope for. "How would you research this?" Harry asked. "House elves at Hogwarts come from many old families," Dobby explained. "Families that served wizards for centuries, that learned their secrets and their magic. Some of these elves remember things that have been forgotten. Dobby could speak with them, could ask about the old ways of dealing with soul magic." "It would be dangerous," Harry pointed out, "if Dumbledore found out what you were doing." "Dobby is willing to take risks for Harry Potter," the elf said simply. "Is willing to face danger if it means Harry Potter might live." The loyalty in Dobby's voice was humbling. Here was someone who asked for nothing in return, who offered everything simply because he believed Harry deserved better than what he'd been given. "Thank you," Harry said quietly, "for everything you're doing, for everything you're risking." "Harry Potter gave Dobby freedom," Dobby replied. "Now Dobby hopes to give Harry Potter choices." The next few days passed slowly, each hour stretching like an eternity as Harry waited for responses to his letters. The Dursleys ignored him completely, too absorbed in their post-Christmas gluttony to remember his existence. Harry found himself grateful for their neglect. It gave him time to think, to plan, to prepare for whatever came next. On the evening of December 28th, Sirius's reply finally arrived. Hedwig landed on Harry's windowsill, looking ruffled and exhausted, her feathers damp with snow and her breathing labored. "Good girl," Harry murmured, untying the letter with hands that shook slightly. "Rest now. You've done well." Sirius's handwriting was more hurried than usual, the letters sharp with barely contained emotion. "Harry, your letter has left me with more questions than answers, but I trust you enough to know you wouldn't write something like this without cause. Whatever you've discovered, whatever information you think I need to see, I'm ready to hear it. Meet me tomorrow night at the old house in Grimmauld Place. I'll make sure we won't be disturbed or overheard. Come by, Flu. The connection from Privet Drive should still work from when we set it up 2 summers ago. I won't lie to you, Harry. Your letter frightened me. Not because I don't trust you, but because I do. If you say something is wrong, then something is wrong, and I need to know what it is. We'll figure this out together. That's what family does." Sirius Harry read the letter 3 times, feeling a warmth in his chest that had nothing to do with the fire burning in his small grate. Sirius had believed him without question, had offered support without demanding explanations. It was the kind of unconditional trust that Harry had thought existed only in fairy tales, the kind of love that Dumbledore's manipulations couldn't touch because they came from authentic connection rather than guided circumstance. "He wants to meet tomorrow night," Harry told Dobby, who was organizing Harry's books with characteristic precision. "That is good," Dobby said. "Sirius Black cares about Harry Potter as a person, not as a symbol. He will listen with his heart as well as his mind." "I hope so," Harry said, "because what I'm about to show him is going to destroy everything he thought he knew about the person he trusted most." The next evening, Harry made his excuses to the Dursleys, not that they were paying attention, and stepped into the fireplace in the living room. The Floo connection to Grimmauld Place sparked to life as soon as he spoke the address, green flames swirling around him with familiar warmth. He stepped out into the kitchen of his godfather's house, brushing soot from his clothes and looking around at the familiar mixture of grandeur and decay that characterized the Black family home. Sirius was waiting for him, pacing back and forth with the restless energy that always marked his more anxious moments. "Harry," Sirius said, crossing the room to pull him into a fierce hug. "Thank Merlin you're all right. When I got your letter, I thought, well, I didn't know what to think." "I'm fine," Harry said, though he wasn't sure that was entirely true. "Physically, anyway. Mentally, that's more complicated." Sirius pulled back, studying Harry's face with the intensity he usually reserved for potential threats. "You look older," he observed, "like something has changed fundamentally." "Something has," Harry confirmed. "Something that's going to be very hard to hear." They settled at the kitchen table, the same table where order meetings had been held, where plans had been made and secrets shared. Now it felt like a place for confessions, for the kind of conversation that changed everything. Harry pulled Dumbledore's journal from his bag, setting it on the table between them like evidence in a trial. "Before I show you this," Harry said carefully, "I need you to promise me something. I need you to promise that you'll read what I'm going to show you with an open mind, that you won't dismiss it just because it challenges what you believe about someone you respect." Sirius frowned. "Harry, what is this about?" "Promise me," Harry insisted. "This is too important for assumptions or preconceptions. I need you to consider the possibility that someone you trust has been lying to you." "All right," Sirius said slowly. "I promise. But Harry, you're starting to frighten me." Harry opened the journal to a page he had marked, one of the entries about Sirius himself. "This is Dumbledore's private journal, his personal thoughts and plans written in his own hand. Dobby helped me acquire it." Sirius's eyes widened as he recognized Dumbledore's handwriting. "Harry, please tell me you didn't steal this from—" "Read," Harry interrupted gently. "Just read, and then we'll talk." Sirius began to read, his expression shifting from confusion to concern to something approaching horror as he processed Dumbledore's clinical discussion of why Harry couldn't be allowed to live with his godfather. "I have decided not to permit Sirius to take custody of Harry, despite his legal right to do so. The boy's attachment to his godfather could interfere with his willingness to accept necessary sacrifices." "Necessary sacrifices," Sirius read aloud, his voice hollow. "What necessary sacrifices? Harry, what is he talking about?" "Keep reading," Harry said quietly. "It gets worse." Sirius continued through the entry, his hands beginning to shake as he read about how his own guilt and instability had been weaponized to keep him away from Harry, how his love for his godson had been seen as a liability rather than a gift. "This can't be real," Sirius whispered. "Dumbledore wouldn't. He couldn't." "There's more," Harry said, turning to another marked page. "Much more. About my placement with the Dursleys, about my friendships, about what he's been preparing me for all these years." He guided Sirius through the most damning entries, watching his godfather's face grow pale and drawn as the full scope of Dumbledore's manipulation became clear. When they reached the entry about Harry's destiny as a willing sacrifice, Sirius actually pushed back from the table as if the journal had caught fire. "No," he said, his voice cracking. "No, this is impossible. Dumbledore cares about you, Harry. He's devoted his life to protecting you." "To preparing me," Harry corrected, "to shaping me into someone who would walk willingly to his death when the time came. Look at the dates, Sirius. Look at how long he's been planning this." Sirius stared at the journal for a long moment, then looked up at Harry with eyes that held a grief too deep for words. "I trusted him," he said simply. "I trusted him with your life, with your happiness, with your future. And all along, he was planning to sacrifice me for the greater good," Harry finished. "To raise a child to die willingly, believing it was heroic rather than tragic." "How long have you known?" Sirius asked. 3 days. Dobby brought me the journal on Christmas morning." Harry's voice was steady, but his hands were clenched on the table. 3 days of trying to figure out what's real and what's been orchestrated. 3 days of wondering if anyone in my life actually cares about me as a person or just sees me as a symbol. "I do," Sirius said immediately, reaching across the table to cover Harry's hands with his own. "Whatever else you doubt, whatever else you question, know that my love for you is real. You're not just James and Lily's son to me. You're Harry. You're my godson, my family, my responsibility. And no one has the right to decide that your life is expendable." The conviction in Sirius's voice broke something loose in Harry's chest, some knot of tension he hadn't even realized he was carrying. Here was someone who saw him as a person first, who valued his life simply because it was his life, not because of what he might accomplish or sacrifice. "What do we do?" Harry asked. "How do we fight someone who has the entire wizarding world convinced he's infallible?" "Carefully," Sirius said grimly, "and with allies. People who can see past the legend to the man underneath. People who care more about truth than about comfortable lies." "I wrote to Ron and Hermione," Harry said, "but I don't know if they'll be able to accept this. They've been taught to worship Dumbledore as much as anyone." "Maybe," Sirius agreed. "But they love you, Harry. That love might be stronger than their conditioning. And if it's not," he shrugged, "then you'll know where you stand." A response to Harry's letter had arrived that morning, addressed in Hermione's neat handwriting, but signed by both his friends. Harry pulled it from his pocket and handed it to Sirius. "Harry, your letter worried us. Not because we don't trust you, but because you sound like you're questioning everything you've been taught. We know you've been under a lot of stress lately, and sometimes stress can make us see conspiracies where none exist. That said, we both love you too much to dismiss your concerns without investigation. Ron says he's always thought there was something off about how much Dumbledore seemed to know, but never shared. And I've been wondering lately why so many of our adventures seem to involve tests that are perfectly suited to our particular talents. We'll listen to what you have to say when we get back to school. But Harry, please be careful about who else you share your doubts with. If you're wrong, spreading suspicion about Dumbledore could damage the entire resistance against Voldemort. We're with you, whatever this is about. We just hope you're prepared to be wrong." Love, Hermione, and Ron Sirius read the letter twice, then looked up at Harry with something like admiration. They're cautious, but they're willing to listen. That's more than most people would offer. "Is it enough?" Harry asked. "It's a start," Sirius replied. "And Harry, they're not wrong to urge caution. What we're talking about here, it could tear apart everything the Order has been working toward. We need to be very sure of our facts before we make accusations this serious." "I am sure," Harry said quietly. "I've read every word of that journal, Sirius. I've seen 17 years of calculated manipulation laid out in Dumbledore's own handwriting. I know what he's done, and I know what he's planning to do." "Then we need to decide what we're going to do about it," Sirius said. "And we need to do it soon. If Dumbledore realizes his journal is missing—" "He'll know it was me," Harry finished. "Or at least, he'll know someone close to me was involved, which means we don't have much time to build our case." They spent the next several hours planning, discussing who might be trusted with the truth and how to approach them safely. Remus was an obvious choice. He had his own complicated relationship with Dumbledore, his own reasons to question some of the decisions that had been made. Some of the other Order members might be persuaded, particularly those who had been kept in the dark about crucial information. But they would need to be careful. Dumbledore's influence ran deep, and many people were too invested in believing he was infallible to consider evidence to the contrary. "What about the other professors?" Sirius asked. "McGonagall, Flitwick, Sprout? They work closely with Dumbledore. They might have noticed things that seemed off." "Maybe," Harry said. "McGonagall has always seemed genuinely protective of students. If she knew what Dumbledore was planning for me, she might be horrified enough to act," Sirius agreed. "But we need to be sure before we approach anyone. One wrong move, and Dumbledore will know we're on to him." As the night wore on, Harry felt something he hadn't experienced since opening Dumbledore's journal. Hope. Not the fragile, desperate hope of a condemned man, but the real, substantial hope of someone who had allies and options and the possibility of changing his fate. "Thank you," he said to Sirius as they prepared to part, "for believing me, for standing with me, for seeing me as someone worth saving instead of someone worth sacrificing. Always," Sirius said fiercely. "You're my family, Harry, my responsibility, my joy, my legacy, and I'll be damned if I let anyone treat you as expendable." Harry returned to Privet Drive through the Floo network, slipping back into his room without alerting the Dursleys to his absence. Dobby was waiting for him, sitting patiently in the desk chair with his hands folded. "How did it go?" the elf asked. "Better than I hoped," Harry admitted. "Sirius believes me. He's furious, but he believes me, and he wants to help." "That is good," Dobby said. "One ally is a beginning. Soon there will be more." Harry settled onto his bed, feeling lighter than he had in days. "Have you had any luck with your research into alternative ways of dealing with Horcruxes?" "Some," Dobby said carefully. Dobby has spoken with 3 of the older house elves at Hogwarts. They remember stories about soul magic, about ways of purifying corruption that do not require death. But Dobby needs to research more, needs to speak with elves from other magical households. "Do you think it's really possible," Harry asked, "that there might be another way?" "Dobby thinks," the elf said slowly, "that Professor Dumbledore is very wise about many things, but he is not wise about everything. And sometimes the wisest person in the room is wrong because they cannot imagine solutions that exist outside their experience." It was a profound observation, one that went to the heart of everything Harry had learned about Dumbledore's methods. The headmaster was brilliant, powerful, knowledgeable, but he was also limited by his own assumptions about how magic worked and what solutions were possible. "Keep researching," Harry said, "and be careful. We can't afford to lose you now." "Dobby will be careful," the elf promised, "but Dobby will not give up. Harry Potter deserves every chance to live, and Dobby will find those chances if they exist." As Harry settled down to sleep that night, he felt something he hadn't experienced in years, the sense that he had real choices ahead of him. Not just the choice between heroic death and cowardly flight, but genuine alternatives that might allow him to live, to grow up, to discover who he might become if he weren't constantly preparing for martyrdom. It would be dangerous. Dumbledore's power and influence were vast, and challenging him would require careful planning and unshakable resolve. But for the first time since opening that journal, Harry felt like he had a real chance of changing his fate. The boy who lived was learning to fight for the right to keep living, and he was no longer fighting alone. The Professor's Dilemma. Professor Minerva McGonagall had always prided herself on her attention to detail. 37 years of teaching had taught her that the smallest inconsistencies often revealed the largest problems, that a careful eye for the overlooked could prevent disasters both academic and personal. It was this same meticulous nature that led her to spend the quiet days between Christmas and New Year reviewing student files, updating records, and ensuring that everything was properly documented for the ministry's increasingly intrusive inspections, which was why she noticed the discrepancy in Harry Potter's admission file. She sat in her office on the morning of December 30th, a cup of tea growing cold at her elbow as she stared at the parchment before her. According to the official records, Harry Potter's Hogwarts letter had been delivered on his 11th birthday, July 31st, 1991. The magical quill that recorded such deliveries had noted the time, location, and recipient with its usual precision. 12:01 a.m., number 4, Privet Drive, Little Whinging, Surrey. Delivered to Harry James Potter. But according to the follow-up reports filed by the Owl Office, the letter had been returned undelivered 3 times before Hagrid was finally dispatched to collect the boy in person. McGonagall frowned, pulling the file closer. She had supervised thousands of Hogwarts admissions, and she had never seen a pattern like this one. Letters didn't simply fail to deliver themselves to wizarding children. The magic that guided them was ancient and nearly infallible. If a letter was returned, it was usually because the child was deceased or had been moved to an untrackable location. Yet Harry Potter had been at Privet Drive all along. The Owl Office reports confirmed his presence at the address. So why hadn't the letter reached him? She pulled out her wand and cast a tracing charm on the documents, the kind of investigative magic she used when students claimed their homework had been eaten by their pets or destroyed by exploding cauldrons. The charm revealed layers of magical interaction, showing her every spell that had touched the parchment since its creation. What she found made her blood run cold. The letter had been intercepted. Not by accident, not by mechanical failure, but by deliberate magical intervention. Someone had placed a redirection charm on Harry Potter's mail, routing it to another location before it could reach his hands. The charm signature was subtle, sophisticated, and achingly familiar. It was Albus Dumbledore's magic. McGonagall sat back in her chair, her mind racing. Dumbledore had intercepted Harry's Hogwarts letter. Not once, but multiple times. He had prevented the boy from learning of his magical heritage until the precise moment that served his purposes, until Hagrid could deliver the news in exactly the way Dumbledore had planned. But why? Her hands trembled slightly as she reached for another file, this one containing the records of Harry's placement with his Muggle relatives. She had argued against that placement, had pleaded with Dumbledore to reconsider leaving a magical child with people who despised magic. But Dumbledore had insisted it was necessary, had spoken of blood protection and ancient magic that required family bonds to function. Now, reviewing the file with the suspicious eye of someone who had just discovered evidence of deception, she found more discrepancies. Financial records showing payments made to the Dursley household, not for Harry's care, as she might have expected, but with specific instructions that the money was not to be used for his benefit. Surveillance reports that detailed neglect and emotional abuse, but recommended no intervention. Medical records from St. Mungo's showing that Harry had been treated for malnutrition during his first year, though no one had thought to investigate why a child from a comfortable middle-class home would be underfed. "Sweet Merlin," she whispered, her voice echoing in the empty office. "What have we done?" A soft knock at her door interrupted her horrified revelations. "Come in," she called, quickly closing the files and attempting to compose herself. Severus Snape entered, moving with his usual fluid grace but carrying himself with an unusual tension. His black eyes swept the office, taking in McGonagall's pale complexion and the scattered documents on her desk. "Minerva," he said carefully, "I hope I'm not interrupting." "Not at all, Severus." She gestured to the chair across from her desk. "Though I confess, your timing is rather fortuitous. I've just made some disturbing discoveries about one of our students. Snape settled into the chair, his long fingers drumming against the armrest. If you're referring to Potter's file, then we have more to discuss than I initially thought. McGonagall's eyes sharpened. You've been investigating Harry as well. Not by choice, Snape replied grimly. Sirius Black paid me a visit yesterday evening. He brought some rather compelling evidence about decisions that have been made regarding Potter's welfare. Decisions that were made without consulting those of us who might have objected to their consequences. What kind of evidence? Instead of answering directly, Snape reached into his robes and withdrew several pieces of parchment, copies of pages he recognized as being written in Dumbledore's distinctive handwriting. Read these, he said quietly, and prepare yourself for some very uncomfortable truths. McGonagall took the documents with hands that weren't quite steady, her eyes scanning the neat script that she had admired for decades. But as she read, her admiration curdled into something much darker. The boy needs to develop independence, resilience, the kind of moral flexibility that comes from navigating difficult circumstances without adult guidance. These are not pleasant necessities, but they are necessities nonetheless. I have increased the financial incentives to the Dursleys, but with careful instructions that the money is not to be spent on Harry's behalf. They are to treat him as a charity case, a burden they bear out of reluctant duty rather than love. Harry Potter must die. The last line hit her like a physical blow. She read it again, then again, hoping the words would somehow change or reveal themselves to be a misunderstanding. But they remained stubbornly, horribly clear. This is Albus's handwriting, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Yes, Snape confirmed. From his private journal. Black claims Potter himself discovered it, that the boy now knows what has been planned for his future. McGonagall set the papers down with shaking hands. Severus, please tell me this is some kind of elaborate forgery. Please tell me that Albus hasn't been systematically orchestrating the suffering of a child in our care. I wish I could, Snape replied, and his voice held a weariness that seemed to come from the depths of his soul. But I've had my own doubts about some of the decisions that have been made. The placement with those muggles never made sense to me. The constant emphasis on Potter's need to suffer, to be humbled, to develop character through hardship. I thought it was misguided paternalism. I never imagined it was part of a larger plan to prepare him for willing martyrdom. How long has he known? McGonagall asked. About his planned death? According to Black, Potter only learned the truth a few days ago. A house elf brought him the journal on Christmas morning. Snape's lips twisted in something that might have been admiration or disgust. Apparently even the elves have more moral clarity than we do. McGonagall buried her face in her hands, feeling the weight of decades of complicity settling on her shoulders like a lead cloak. How many times had she seen Harry looking too thin, too withdrawn, too quick to accept blame and punishment? How many times had she told herself that Dumbledore knew best, that her concerns were simply maternal fussing that had no place in the greater struggle against Voldemort? We've failed him, she said quietly. All of us. We've failed that boy so completely that it took a house elf to show him the truth about his own life. Yes, Snape agreed, and his simple acknowledgement was somehow more damning than any passionate accusation could have been. We have. The question is what we intend to do about it now. McGonagall looked up at him, studying the face that had remained inscrutable through 6 years of war and uncertainty. What are you suggesting? That we decide here and now whether our loyalty is to Dumbledore or to the children in our care, Snape said, because I don't believe we can serve both any longer. The words hung in the air between them, heavy with implication. McGonagall had served as deputy headmistress for nearly 2 decades, had built her entire professional identity around supporting Dumbledore's vision and implementing his policies. The idea of actively opposing him, of choosing a different path, was almost incomprehensible. But the image of Harry Potter, thin, brave, self-sacrificing Harry Potter, who had never been told that he was anything more than a weapon to be aimed at the enemy, made the choice surprisingly clear. "What do you propose we do?" she asked. "We start by acknowledging that Potter deserves better than what we've given him," Snape said. "We stop treating his welfare as secondary to Dumbledore's grand strategy. We start asking questions about decisions that affect our students, and we demand answers that actually make sense. And if Dumbledore refuses to provide those answers?" Snape's smile was sharp and humorless. "Then we find other ways to protect the children who need protecting. We remember that our first loyalty should be to them, not to the man who signs our paychecks." McGonagall nodded slowly, feeling something shift inside her chest. For years she had felt the weight of unasked questions, unvoiced concerns, instinctive objections that she had suppressed in the name of institutional loyalty. Now, finally, she was allowing herself to acknowledge what she had always known, that Harry Potter deserved better than what they had given him, and that sometimes protecting a child meant opposing the adults who claimed to know what was best. "There's something else," she said, pulling Harry's admission file back toward her. "I was reviewing his records when you arrived. Albus intercepted his Hogwarts letter. Multiple times. Harry never received his invitation to attend school. Hagrid had to deliver it personally, because Albus wanted to control exactly how and when the boy learned of his heritage." "Of course he did," Snape said bitterly. "Can't have Potter developing too much confidence or independence before his training begins." A new voice interrupted them from the doorway. "Begging your pardon, Professor McGonagall, but I couldn't help overhearing." Both professors turned to see Rubeus Hagrid standing in the entrance to McGonagall's office, his massive frame filling the doorway and his beetle-black eyes bright with unshed tears. "Hagrid," McGonagall said carefully. "How long have you been there?" "Long enough," Hagrid replied, stepping into the office and closing the door behind him. "Long enough to hear that I've been part of something terrible without knowing it." He pulled up a chair, or rather, conjured one that could actually support his weight, and sat down heavily, his hands clasped in his lap, like a schoolboy called to account for misbehavior. "I delivered that letter to Harry," he said quietly. "Saw how them Dursleys treated him, saw how little he knew about his own world, about his parents, about what he meant to people like us. Thought I was doing something wonderful, giving him the key to the life he was meant to have." "You were," McGonagall said firmly. "Whatever Albus's motivations, you gave Harry the chance to discover his heritage and his abilities. You gave him Hogwarts." "Did I?" Hagrid asked, looking up at her with eyes that held a painful kind of wisdom. "Or did I just deliver him to another kind of cage? A prettier one, maybe, with more comfortable bars, but still a cage designed to hold him until it was time for him to die." The simple eloquence of Hagrid's words cut through McGonagall's remaining defences. Here was a man who had never pretended to intellectual sophistication, who had always been dismissed as simple and emotional, and he had grasped the moral reality of their situation more clearly than any of the rest of them. "What do you know about Harry's current situation?" Snape asked carefully. "Not much," Hagrid admitted, "but I know Sirius Black has been asking questions, and I know that House Elf of Dumbledore's has been acting strange lately. Dobby, the one who works in the kitchens, been talking to the other elves, asking about old magic and such. And I know Harry looked different when he left for the holidays. Older, somehow. Like he'd learned something that changed him." McGonagall and Snape exchanged glances. If Hagrid had noticed changes in both Dobby and Harry, then their conspiracy was less secret than they had hoped. "Hagrid," McGonagall said gently, "what would you say if I told you that Harry has learned some very difficult truths about his life and his future, and that those truths have led him to question some of the guidance he's received from people he trusted?" "I'd say it's about time," Hagrid replied without hesitation. "That boy's been carrying burdens that weren't his to carry for too long. If he's finally asking questions, Then maybe he's starting to stand up for himself. Even if those questions challenge Albus's authority? Snape asked. Hagrid was quiet for a long moment, his hands working nervously in his lap. When he finally spoke, his voice was heavy with grief, but steady with resolve. "Professor Dumbledore saved my life," he said slowly. "Gave me a home when I had nowhere else to go. Trusted me with important work when nobody else would. I owe him everything." He paused, looking directly at McGonagall, and then at Snape. "But I owe Harry Potter something too. I was there the night his parents died. I carried him away from that house, held him while he cried for people who couldn't answer. And I promised myself that night that I'd do whatever I could to keep him safe, to help him grow up strong and happy." His voice broke slightly. "If Professor Dumbledore's plans mean Harry has to die, then I can't support those plans. I don't care who gets angry with me or what it costs me. That boy deserves better than being raised to sacrifice himself for people who won't even try to find another way." McGonagall felt tears prick her eyes at the simple honesty in Hagrid's declaration. Here was loyalty in its purest form, not blind obedience to authority, but genuine care for a person who needed protection. "Then we're in agreement," she said, her voice steady despite her emotions. "Our first responsibility is to Harry, not to Albus or to anyone else." "But we need to be careful," Snape warned. "Dumbledore's influence runs deep, and he has decades of experience manipulating situations to his advantage. If we're going to oppose him effectively, we need to be smart about it." "What do you suggest?" McGonagall asked. "We start by gathering information," Snape replied. "We document everything we can about the decisions that have been made regarding Potter's welfare. We identify other staff members who might be sympathetic to our concerns. We build a case that can't be dismissed or explained away. And we protect Harry," Hagrid added firmly. "Whatever else we do, we make sure that boy knows he's not alone, that he has people on his side who see him as more than just a weapon." McGonagall nodded, feeling the weight of decision settling around her like armor. "Very well, but this must stay between us for now. We can't afford to tip our hand before we're ready." "Agreed," Snape said. "Though I should warn you, Sirius Black is already involved, and he's not known for his subtlety. If he decides to confront Dumbledore directly, then we'd better make sure we're ready to support him when he does," McGonagall finished. "Because ready or not, I think this conflict is coming whether we want it or not." The three professors sat in silence for a moment, each contemplating the magnitude of what they had just committed to. They were preparing to challenge the most powerful wizard in Britain, a man who had shaped magical society for decades and who commanded the respect and loyalty of virtually everyone in their world. But they were doing it for Harry Potter, for a boy who had been failed by every adult who was supposed to protect him, and who deserved the chance to choose his own fate. "There's something else," McGonagall said, breaking the silence. "If we're going to do this, we need to understand exactly what we're fighting for. What does Harry want? What kind of future is he hoping for?" "I don't know," Snape admitted. "According to Black, the boy only learned the truth a few days ago. He's probably still processing what it means, still trying to figure out who he is when he's not being shaped by someone else's expectations." "Then we help him figure that out," Hagrid said simply. "We give him the space and time and support he needs to discover what he wants for himself, and then we help him fight for it." McGonagall smiled, the first genuine smile she'd managed since discovering the irregularities in Harry's file. "You know, Hagrid, for someone who claims not to be clever, you have a remarkable gift for cutting straight to the heart of things." "Just care about that boy," Hagrid said, ducking his head in embarrassment. "Hard to see clearly when you care that much, sometimes, but also hard to be wrong about what matters." As if summoned by their conversation, a soft tapping at the window announced the arrival of an owl. McGonagall recognized it as one of the school's post owls, though it was unusual for mail to arrive so late in the evening. She opened the window and untied the letter from the owl's leg, frowning at the unfamiliar handwriting on the envelope. It was addressed simply to the professors who care more about students than politics. That's oddly specific, Snape observed. McGonagall broke the seal and unfolded the parchment, her eyebrows rising as she read the contents aloud. To Professor McGonagall, Professor Snape, and Professor Hagrid, I hope this letter finds you well, and that you'll forgive the unusual method of delivery. Dobby helped me identify which professors might be willing to listen to some difficult truths about decisions that have been made regarding my welfare. I know that recent conversations have raised questions about Professor Dumbledore's methods and motivations. I want you to know that I appreciate your concern and your willingness to ask hard questions. I'm not writing to ask you to choose sides or to demand that you oppose someone you respect. I'm writing to ask that you remember something that seems to have been forgotten. I'm a person, not a symbol. I have hopes and fears and dreams that matter, not because of what I might accomplish, but simply because they're mine. If you truly want to help me, then help me become someone who lives for more than just his death. Help me discover what I might be capable of when I'm not constantly preparing for martyrdom. I know I can't ask you to abandon your principles or betray your convictions, but I hope I can ask you to consider the possibility that there might be other ways to defeat Voldemort, ways that don't require a 17-year-old boy to die willingly for sins that were never his to atone for. Thank you for caring enough to ask questions. Thank you for seeing me as someone worth protecting, rather than someone worth sacrificing. Respectfully, Harry James Potter. The office fell silent as McGonagall finished reading. The letter was eloquent, without being manipulative, honest without being accusatory. It was the voice of a young man who had been forced to grow up too quickly, but who still held on to hope that adults might sometimes choose to do the right thing. Well, Snape said finally, his voice rough with emotion, I think we have our answer about what Potter wants. He wants to live, Hagrid said simply. Wants to have a future that's his own choice. Can't say I blame him for that. McGonagall folded the letter carefully, treating it with the reverence due to a document that might change everything. Then that's what we'll fight for, she said. Harry Potter's right to choose his own path, whatever that path might be. It won't be easy, Snape warned. Dumbledore will not surrender his plans without a struggle, and there are others, ministry officials, order members, even some of our colleagues, who believe that individual lives are acceptable losses in service of the greater good. Then we'll change their minds, McGonagall said firmly. We'll show them that there are other ways to fight this war, ways that don't require sacrificing children on the altar of strategic necessity. And if we can't change their minds? Hagrid asked. Then we'll make sure Harry knows that not everyone sees him as expendable, McGonagall replied. We'll give him the support and protection he needs to find his own solutions, to become the person he wants to be, rather than the person others need him to be. As the three professors prepared to part, each returning to their own quarters and their own contemplations, McGonagall felt something she hadn't experienced in years. The sense that she was finally, truly fighting for something that mattered. Not for abstract principles or political advantages or strategic necessities, but for a boy who had been failed by every adult in his life and who deserved the chance to discover what he might become when given the freedom to choose. The war against Voldemort would continue, but it would no longer be fought at Harry Potter's expense. They would find another way, or they would die trying. But Harry would live. Whatever else happened, Harry Potter would have the chance to live. Return to Hogwarts. The Hogwarts Express felt different. Harry sat in his usual compartment with Ron and Hermione, watching the familiar countryside roll past the window, and tried to pinpoint exactly what had changed. The train was the same, still red and gleaming, still filled with the chatter of students returning from Christmas holidays. His friends were the same. Ron complaining about his mother's insistence that he wear his new jumper, Hermione already buried in a book about advanced transfiguration theory. Even the sweets trolley witch was the same, offering the same array of chocolate frogs and pumpkin pasties. But Harry was different, and that difference coloured everything else. He found himself studying Ron's easy smile and wondering how much of their friendship had been genuine choice versus careful guidance. He watched Hermione flip through her textbook with characteristic intensity and tried to calculate how many of their shared adventures had been orchestrated rather than accidental. Every familiar comfort of the journey back to school felt tainted by knowledge he couldn't unknow, weighted by questions he couldn't stop asking. "You're quiet today," Hermione observed, looking up from her book with the sharp-eyed concern that had characterized her approach to Harry's well-being for 6 years. "Everything all right?" "Just thinking," Harry replied, which was true enough. He had been thinking almost constantly since Christmas morning, his mind churning through revelations and implications and possibilities for what came next. "About what we discussed in your letter?" Ron asked, lowering his voice slightly. "The stuff about Dumbledore?" Harry nodded, grateful that his friends had at least been willing to acknowledge his concerns rather than dismissing them outright. Their response had been cautious, but not condemning, which was more than he had dared to hope for. "I know you said you'd found some information that didn't add up," Hermione said carefully. "But Harry, you have to understand how difficult this is to process. Professor Dumbledore has been our mentor, our protector, our guide through everything we've faced. The idea that he might be—" She trailed off, seemingly unable to voice the possibility. "Manipulating us?" Harry supplied. "Using us? Lying to us about what he's really planning?" "Yes," Hermione said quietly. "Exactly that." Ron shifted uncomfortably in his seat. "Look, mate, I'm not saying you're wrong. You've never been one to make things up or cause drama for the sake of it. But this is Dumbledore we're talking about, the man who defeated Grindelwald, who's been fighting you-know-who longer than we've been alive. If he's made decisions we don't understand, maybe it's because he knows things we don't." "Or maybe," Harry said, his voice steady, but carrying an edge that made both his friends look at him more carefully. "It's because he's made decisions that can't be justified to the people they affect most. Maybe some secrets aren't kept to protect us. Maybe they're kept to protect him from having to face what he's really done." The compartment fell quiet, except for the rhythmic clicking of wheels against track. Harry could see his friends processing his words, trying to reconcile the Harry they knew, generally trusting, willing to give adults the benefit of the doubt, with this newer version who questioned authority and challenged assumptions. "What exactly did you find?" Hermione asked finally. "What evidence made you start questioning everything?" Harry had been dreading this moment and preparing for it in equal measure. He couldn't show them Dumbledore's journal. Not yet. Not here where anyone might overhear or interrupt. But he could share enough to plant the seeds of doubt, to prepare them for larger revelations that would come later. "Do you remember my first year?" he asked. "When I had to get past all those protections to reach the Philosopher's Stone?" "Of course," Ron said. "Scariest thing we'd done up to that point." "What struck you as odd about those protections?" Harry asked. "Looking back now, with everything we've learned since then." Hermione frowned, her analytical mind automatically engaging with the puzzle. "They were surprisingly suited to our particular talents," she said slowly. "The devil's snare that I happened to know how to handle, the flying keys that Ron could catch because of his Quidditch experience, the chess set that played to Ron's strategic strengths. The potions logic puzzle that you could solve because of your systematic approach to problems," Harry continued. "The mirror that showed me exactly what I needed to see to retrieve the stone without wanting to use it. Almost like they were designed for us specifically," Ron finished, his voice growing quiet with realization. "But that's impossible," Hermione said, though she sounded less certain than usual. "Those protections were put in place by the teachers, each contributing their own area of expertise. They couldn't have known we would be the ones trying to get through." "Unless," Harry said carefully, Someone told them exactly what kinds of challenges to create. Someone who knew that 3 first-year students would eventually make their way through that gauntlet, and who wanted to make sure we succeeded. The implications hung in the air between them, uncomfortable and inescapable. Harry watched his friends' faces as they worked through the logic, saw the moment when they began to understand what he was suggesting. "You're saying Dumbledore wanted us to get to the stone," Ron said. "That he designed the whole thing as some kind of test." "I'm saying it's worth considering," Harry replied, "just like it's worth considering why so many of our other adventures have followed similar patterns. Why we keep finding ourselves in situations that test our abilities in very specific ways, always with just enough support to succeed, but never so much that we don't have to struggle for it." Hermione was quiet for a long moment, her fingers drumming against the cover of her book in the way they always did when she was thinking through a complex problem. "If you're right," she said finally, "if Professor Dumbledore has been orchestrating our experiences, why? What would be the point of putting us through all that danger and stress?" "Maybe," Harry said, choosing his words carefully, "to prepare us for something bigger. Something he thinks we'll need to face eventually." "The war," Ron said. "You know who?" "Maybe." Harry looked out the window again, watching the Scottish countryside roll past. "Or maybe something more specific than that. Something that requires very particular skills and very particular moral flexibility." The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of the sweets trolley, but Harry could see that his words had planted the seeds he'd hoped for. Ron and Hermione were thinking now, questioning, looking at their shared history through a different lens. It wasn't the complete revelation he would eventually share with them, but it was a beginning. When the train finally pulled into Hogsmeade Station, Harry felt his stomach tighten with anticipation and dread. The castle loomed before them in the evening darkness, its windows glowing warmly against the winter sky. It had always represented safety and belonging to him, a place where he could be himself without fear or pretense. Now it felt like walking into enemy territory. The great hall buzzed with the familiar energy of students returning from holidays, friends reuniting and comparing gifts and sharing stories. Harry took his usual seat at the Gryffindor table, nodding to his housemates and participating in conversations with a part of his mind, while the rest remained focused on scanning the staff table. Dumbledore was there, of course, presiding over the feast with his characteristic benevolent smile. But Harry thought he detected something different in the headmaster's demeanour, a subtle tension around his eyes that suggested preoccupation with matters beyond the usual administrative concerns. McGonagall caught Harry's eye from her position at the staff table, offering the barest hint of a nod. Snape, typically, showed no outward acknowledgement of Harry's presence, but his dark eyes lingered on Harry's face a moment longer than usual. Hagrid, seated at the far end of the table, gave Harry an encouraging wave that managed to convey both warmth and caution. The feast proceeded normally enough, with Dumbledore offering his usual welcome-back remarks about the importance of education and the value of working together in difficult times. But Harry found himself analysing every word, searching for hidden meanings and subtle manipulations in phrases that had once seemed simply wise and encouraging. "Knowledge," Dumbledore said, his voice carrying easily across the hall, "is a gift that we must accept with both gratitude and responsibility. Not everything we learn will be comfortable, but growth requires us to embrace difficult truths and trust in the wisdom of those who guide us." Harry's jaw clenched. Was that directed at him? A warning about challenging authority? Or was he reading too much into words that might have been perfectly innocent? After the feast, Harry managed to catch McGonagall's attention as students filed out of the hall. She gave him a look that conveyed both understanding and caution, then nodded toward a corridor that led away from the main flow of student traffic. Harry followed at a discreet distance, his heart hammering with nervous energy. This would be his first real test of the alliance he'd been building, his first chance to discover whether the adults who'd promised to support him would actually follow through. McGonagall led him to a small classroom on the 3rd floor, one that was rarely used in the evening hours. She cast several privacy charms before turning to face him, her expression mixing concern with something that might have been admiration. "Mr. Potter," she said quietly, "I trust your holidays were educational." "That's one way to put it," Harry replied. "Professor McGonagall, I need to know, can I trust you? Really trust you, not just with my safety, but with the truth about what I've learned." McGonagall studied his face for a long moment, seeing something there that made her expression soften with what looked like grief. "You can trust me, Harry," she said, and the use of his first name carried a weight of intimacy that their previous interactions had rarely achieved. "Professor Snape and Professor Hagrid as well. We've had some very difficult conversations over the past few days, and we've reached some very difficult conclusions about decisions that have been made regarding your welfare." Relief flooded through Harry's chest, warm and overwhelming. "You know, then, about the journal, about what he's been planning." "We know enough," McGonagall said grimly. "Enough to understand that you've been failed by the adults who were supposed to protect you. Enough to recognize that some of the decisions made in your name were not made with your best interests at heart." "What happens now?" Harry asked. "How do we move forward when he's still the headmaster, still in control of everything that happens here?" "Carefully," McGonagall replied, "and with the understanding that this is not going to be resolved quickly or easily. Dumbledore has built his authority over decades, and challenging it will require patience and strategy. But you're willing to do it, to risk your positions, your careers, to stand up for what's right." McGonagall's smile was fierce and protective in a way that reminded Harry why she had always been one of his favorite teachers. "Harry," she said, "I became a teacher to help children learn and grow and discover who they might become. If I can't protect a student from being sacrificed for someone else's notion of the greater good, then what is the point of any of it?" They talked for nearly an hour, McGonagall sharing what she and the other professors had discovered in their own investigations, Harry providing more context from Dumbledore's journal. By the time they parted, Harry felt like he had genuine allies within the castle, people who were committed to helping him find alternatives to the path Dumbledore had laid out. But he also felt the weight of the game they were now playing, the careful balance required to gather information and build support without alerting Dumbledore to their activities. The next few days fell into a pattern of surface normalcy, hiding deeper currents of tension and change. Harry attended classes, completed assignments, participated in the ordinary rhythms of school life. But underneath it all, he was learning to navigate a more complex reality. In Transfiguration, McGonagall treated him with the same professional demeanor she'd always maintained, but Harry caught subtle signals of support and encouragement. A nod when he asked challenging questions about magical theory, a slight smile when he demonstrated mastery of concepts that went beyond the required curriculum, small gestures that reminded him he wasn't alone. In potions, Snape remained his typically acerbic self, offering cutting criticism of Harry's brewing technique and questioning his understanding of ingredient interactions. But Harry began to notice that the criticism was more constructive than destructive, that Snape's challenges pushed him toward better understanding rather than simple failure. It was still unpleasant, but it felt like teaching rather than persecution. Defense against the dark arts remained problematic, taught as it was by a rotation of questionably qualified instructors who seemed more interested in following ministry guidelines than actually preparing students for the realities of magical combat. Harry found himself questioning everything they were taught, wondering how much of their education was designed to produce compliant citizens rather than capable defenders. "You're being awfully critical lately," Hermione observed, after a particularly frustrating data lesson in which they'd spent an hour learning theoretical principles that had no practical application. "About everything, really. The lessons, the teachers, the whole structure of how we're being educated." "Maybe that's because it's worth being critical of," Harry replied, Maybe we should be asking more questions about why we're being taught certain things and not others, why some knowledge is considered acceptable for students and some isn't. But we're still students, Ron protested. We don't know enough to judge what's important and what isn't. Don't we? Harry asked. We've faced life or death situations multiple times, Ron. We've been thrown into dangerous circumstances that required knowledge and skills we weren't taught in any classroom. Maybe our experience counts for something. It was a variation of conversations they'd been having all week. Harry pushing his friends to question assumptions they'd always taken for granted, Ron and Hermione struggling to balance their trust in institutional authority with their growing recognition that Harry's concerns had merit. The breakthrough came during a study session in the library when Hermione was researching protective enchantments for an essay McGonagall had assigned. "This doesn't make sense," she muttered, frowning at a passage in an advanced defensive magic textbook. According to this, the Fidelius charm creates a perfect secret, one that can't be extracted even under torture or veritaserum. But your parents were found by Voldemort. Their location was betrayed. Peter Pettigrew was their secret keeper, Harry said. He told Voldemort where they were. But that's exactly my point, Hermione said, her voice growing excited in the way it always did when she was working through a complex problem. If the Fidelius charm was properly cast, Pettigrew would have been magically unable to reveal the secret even if he wanted to. The betrayal shouldn't have been possible unless... She trailed off, her face going pale as the implications hit her. "Unless what?" Ron asked. "Unless the charm wasn't properly cast," Harry said quietly, understanding what Hermione had realized. Or unless it was deliberately weakened in some way. Made possible to break under the right circumstances. "But who would do that?" Ron asked. "Who would sabotage your parents' protection?" Harry and Hermione looked at each other, the answer hanging unspoken between them. There was only one person who would have had the knowledge and authority to modify the Fidelius charm. Only one person who might have had reasons to ensure that it could be broken when the time was right. "No," Ron said, shaking his head. "No, that's impossible. Dumbledore wouldn't sacrifice my parents to serve a larger purpose?" Harry asked. "Are you sure about that, Ron? Are you absolutely certain that there's any line Dumbledore wouldn't cross if he thought it served the greater good?" Ron looked stricken, his freckles standing out starkly against his pale skin. "But they were his friends, people he cared about." "And I'm someone he claims to care about, too," Harry pointed out. "But according to his own private notes, he's been planning my death since I was a baby. So maybe his version of caring isn't the same as what the rest of us would recognize." Hermione was staring at the textbook, her hands trembling slightly. "If this is true," she whispered, "if Professor Dumbledore allowed your parents to die as part of some larger plan—" "Harry, that changes everything." "Yes," Harry said simply. "It does." They sat in silence for several minutes, the weight of possibility settling around them like a suffocating blanket. Finally, Ron spoke up, his voice rough with emotion. "What do you need from us, mate? What do you need us to do?" "I need you to keep questioning everything," Harry replied. "Keep looking for inconsistencies and contradictions. Keep thinking for yourselves instead of just accepting what you're told. And when the time comes for me to make some very difficult decisions about my future, I need you to support my right to choose for myself, rather than trying to talk me into doing what other people think is best." "Always," Hermione said immediately. "Whatever you decide, wherever this leads, we're with you." "Even if it means opposing Dumbledore directly?" Harry asked. Ron swallowed hard, but his voice was steady when he answered. "Even then." "You're our friend, Harry. Our loyalty is to you, not to anyone else." As they packed up their books and prepared to return to Gryffindor Tower, Harry felt a warmth in his chest that had nothing to do with the library's fireplace. Ron and Hermione had made their choice, had chosen him over institutional authority and comfortable assumptions. Whatever came next, he wouldn't face it alone. But he was also aware that their conversation in the library had been overheard. Madame Pince might dismiss student chatter as unimportant, but other ears were always listening in a place like Hogwarts. Information had a way of reaching people who might be interested in student discussions of protective charms and betrayed secrets. That night, as Harry lay in his bed in Gryffindor Tower, Dobby appeared beside him with a soft pop. "Harry Potter," the elf whispered urgently. "Dobby has news. Professor Dumbledore has been asking questions about missing documents. He knows something has been taken from his private study." Harry's stomach clenched. "Does he know it was his journal?" "Not yet," Dobby replied. "But he is suspicious. He has cast tracking charms on his office, placed additional protections on his private quarters, and Dobby has heard him speaking with Professor Snape about unusual student behavior." "What did he say?" "He asked Professor Snape if he had noticed any changes in Harry Potter's attitude or demeanor. Professor Snape said that Harry Potter seemed more mature lately, more thoughtful about his studies. Professor Dumbledore did not seem pleased by this observation." Harry processed this information, understanding its implications. Dumbledore knew something was wrong, was beginning to investigate. The careful game they'd been playing was about to become more dangerous. "Dobby," Harry said quietly, "I need you to be extra careful. Don't do anything that might expose your involvement in this. If Dumbledore realizes you're the one who took his journal—" "Dobby understands the risks, Harry Potter," the elf replied firmly. "But Dobby will not abandon Harry Potter now. Dobby will continue to help, continue to research alternatives, continue to watch for danger. House elves are very good at being invisible when they need to be." "Thank you," Harry said, "for everything you're risking, for everything you're doing." "Harry Potter gave Dobby freedom," Dobby said simply. "Now Dobby gives Harry Potter truth. It is a fair exchange." After Dobby disappeared, Harry lay awake, staring at the ceiling of his dormitory, listening to the quiet breathing of his sleeping roommates. The comfortable world of Hogwarts, of shared dormitories and house loyalty and unquestioned authority, felt more fragile than ever. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new tests of the alliances he was building and the choices he was making. Dumbledore was beginning to suspect that something had changed, which meant the careful balance of the past week couldn't last much longer. Soon, very soon, Harry would have to decide whether to continue playing this subtle game of resistance or to bring everything out into the open, whether to keep pretending that he didn't know what fate had been planned for him, or to force a confrontation that would change everything. The boy who lived was learning to think strategically, to consider consequences and alternatives and the cost of different choices. It was perhaps the most important education he'd ever received, even if it wasn't the one Dumbledore had planned for him. Outside his window, the castle settled into its nighttime rhythms, ancient stones breathing with accumulated magic and accumulated secrets. But in the darkness of his dormitory bed, Harry Potter planned for a future that was finally, truly his own to choose. The game was changing. Soon, everyone would have to decide which side they were really on. The Horcrux Truth. The revelation came to Harry on a Tuesday morning in late January, while he sat in the empty Gryffindor common room before dawn, poring over Dumbledore's journal for what must have been the 100th time. He had been searching for additional evidence to share with Sirius and Remus, documentation that might help them understand the full scope of Dumbledore's manipulations. What he found instead was something that shattered his understanding of himself so completely that he wasn't sure he could ever put the pieces back together. The entry was dated from his second year, written just after the Chamber of Secrets incident. Harry had read it before, but somehow the full implications hadn't penetrated his consciousness until this moment, when the pre-dawn quiet of the castle made every word echo with devastating clarity. Harry's encounter with Tom Riddle's memory has provided invaluable insight into his connection with Voldemort. The ease with which he channeled the basilisk's venom into destroying the diary suggests that his ability to resist dark magic is stronger than I dared hope. More significantly, his natural affinity for Parseltongue and his visceral response to Riddle's presence confirm what I have long suspected. The night Voldemort tried to kill him, a fragment of the Dark Lord's soul lodged itself in Harry's scar, making the boy himself an accidental Horcrux. Harry's hands began to shake as the words sank in, each letter carving itself into his consciousness like acid on stone. A Horcrux. He was a Horcrux. Part of Voldemort lived inside his head, had been living there for 16 years, influencing his thoughts and emotions and choices in ways he couldn't even begin to comprehend. This development is both terrible and providential. Terrible because it means Harry carries a piece of the Dark Lord within him, that his very existence is tied to Voldemort's survival. Providential because it provides the key to Voldemort's ultimate defeat. As long as the soul fragment remains within Harry, Voldemort cannot truly die. But when the time comes for final victory, Harry's willing sacrifice will destroy both himself and the piece of Voldemort's soul he carries, ensuring that the Dark Lord can never return. The journal slipped from Harry's numb fingers, falling to the carpet with a soft thud that seemed to echo through the empty common room. He pressed his hands to his temples, his scar throbbing with a pain that felt different now. Not the warning of Voldemort's presence, but the ache of recognizing something that had always been there, hiding in plain sight. How many times had he felt impulses that weren't his own? How many moments of anger or cruelty or darkness had come from the fragment of Tom Riddle's soul that shared his body? When he'd spoken to the snake at the zoo before his first year, when he'd argued with the Sorting Hat about being placed in Slytherin, when he'd felt the pull of power and the temptation to use his abilities for less than noble purposes, had any of that been truly him, or had it all been Voldemort's influence seeping through the boundaries of his mind? No, Harry whispered to himself, his voice barely audible in the empty room. No, this isn't real. It can't be real. But even as he said the words, he knew. They were a lie. It explained too much, made sense of too many things that had never quite fit. The connection he felt to Voldemort's thoughts and emotions, his ability to speak Parseltongue, the way dark magic seemed to recognize him, to respond to him with an eagerness that had always troubled the adults around him. He wasn't just Harry Potter, the boy who lived. He was Harry Potter, the boy who carried a piece of the darkest wizard in history inside his own soul. The thought made him sick, bile rising in his throat as the implications cascaded through his mind. Every choice he'd made, every moment of heroism or kindness or love, how could he know what was genuinely his, and what was the product of an endless internal struggle between his own nature and Voldemort's corruption? Harry? The voice startled him so badly that he nearly fell off the sofa. Hermione stood at the bottom of the stairs leading to the girls' dormitories, her hair tangled from sleep and her expression concerned. She was wearing her dressing gown and slippers, clearly having been woken by something. "What are you doing down here so early?" she asked, moving closer and noticing the journal on the floor. "And what's wrong? You look terrible." Harry tried to speak, but no words came. "How did you tell your best friend that you'd just discovered you were part monster? How did you explain that everything she thought she knew about you might be a lie?" "Harry," Hermione said, more urgently, settling beside him on the sofa and picking up the fallen journal. "What did you find?" "Don't," Harry said, reaching for the journal, but Hermione had already opened it to the page he'd been reading. He watched her face as she processed Dumbledore's clinical analysis of what Harry was, saw the moment when understanding hit her like a physical blow. Her face went pale, then grey, and her hands began to shake, much as his had moments before. "Oh, Harry," she whispered, looking up at him with eyes full of tears. "Oh, Harry, I'm so sorry." The sympathy in her voice was what finally broke him. Harry doubled over, his hands covering his face as sobs tore from his chest, raw, ugly sounds that seemed to come from somewhere deeper than his lungs. "I'm him," Harry gasped between ragged breaths. "Part of me is him. Every time I've been angry or cruel or wanted to hurt someone, every time I've felt that pull toward power or darkness, it wasn't me struggling with normal human impulses. It was Voldemort. It was his soul inside mine, corrupting everything I am. No, Hermione said firmly, dropping the journal and pulling Harry into a fierce hug. No, Harry, that's not true. That's not how any of this works. How do you know? Harry demanded, pulling back to look at her with eyes that were bright with tears and desperation. How can you possibly know what it's like to have a piece of a monster living in your head for 16 years? How can you know what thoughts are mine and what thoughts are his? Hermione was quiet for a moment, her analytical mind clearly working through the problem with the same systematic approach she brought to every intellectual challenge. Because I know you, she said finally. I've seen you make choices, Harry. I've watched you choose kindness when cruelty would have been easier. I've seen you sacrifice your own interests to protect people who couldn't protect themselves. I've watched you struggle with difficult decisions and consistently come down on the side of protecting the innocent and defending the helpless. But what if those weren't my choices? Harry asked. What if I only made them because some part of me was fighting against Voldemort's influence? What if the only reason I seem good is because I'm constantly at war with the evil inside me? Then you're still good, Hermione said without hesitation. Harry, if you've been fighting Voldemort's influence for 16 years and winning, if you've managed to be kind and brave and loyal despite carrying a piece of his soul, then that doesn't make you less than you were. It makes you more. Harry stared at her, trying to process her words through the fog of self-doubt and horror that had settled over his mind. You really believe that? I know it, Hermione said firmly. Harry, you're not defined by what was done to you when you were a baby. You're defined by every choice you've made since then, every moment when you chose to help instead of hurt, every time you put yourself at risk to protect someone else. That's who you are. Not the accident of having Voldemort's soul fragment attached to your own, but the person who spent 16 years proving that love and courage are stronger than hatred and fear. Before Harry could respond, footsteps on the stairs announced Ron's arrival. He descended from the boys' dormitories, looking bleary-eyed and concerned, clearly drawn by the sound of their conversation. What's going on? He asked, taking in Harry's tear-streaked face and Hermione's protective posture. Harry, mate, what's happened? He found something else in the journal, Hermione said quietly. Something about what he is. What Voldemort did to him the night he tried to kill him. Ron's expression grew serious as he settled into one of the armchairs across from them. What kind of something? Harry couldn't bring himself to say the words again, so Hermione reached for the journal and read Dumbledore's entry aloud. Ron's face went through the same progression of emotions that Harry imagined his own had: confusion, understanding, horror, and finally a kind of fierce protectiveness. Bloody hell, Ron said quietly when Hermione finished reading. Then more firmly, so what? So what? Harry repeated, staring at his friend in disbelief. Ron, did you hear what she just read? I'm a Horcrux. I've got a piece of Voldemort's soul stuck in my head. I'm part monster. No, you're not, Ron said, with the same unwavering certainty that had characterized his loyalty for 6 years. You're Harry Potter. You're my best mate. You're the person who saved my sister's life in the Chamber of Secrets, who helped me overcome my fears in first year, who stood by me even when I've been an absolute git. I don't care what dark magic Voldemort used on you when you were a baby. I care about who you've chosen to be every day since then. But how can you trust those choices? Harry asked desperately. How can any of us trust them when we don't know what influence Voldemort's soul has had on my thoughts and decisions? Ron was quiet for a moment, his brow furrowed in thought. When he finally spoke, his words carried a weight of consideration that showed how much he'd grown over their years of friendship. Harry, he said carefully, do you remember second year, when everyone thought you were Slytherin's heir? When people were afraid of you because you could talk to snakes? Of course. And do you remember what you told us? About hearing the voice in the walls, about being afraid that maybe you really were doing those things and just didn't remember? Harry nodded, the memory still painful after all these years. You were terrified that you might be something you weren't, Ron continued. You were so scared of hurting innocent people that you were willing to believe you might be a monster. Does that sound like the response of someone whose soul is corrupted by evil? I don't know, Harry said weakly. I do, Ron said firmly. Evil doesn't worry about being evil, Harry. Voldemort doesn't lie awake at night, wondering if he's doing the right thing. The fact that you're horrified by the idea of having darkness inside you is proof that your core self, the part that really matters, is fundamentally good. Hermione nodded emphatically. Ron's right. And Harry, think about what this revelation actually means. You've been carrying a piece of Voldemort's soul for 16 years, fighting its influence every single day, and you've still managed to become the person we know and love. That's not a sign of corruption. It's a sign of extraordinary strength and goodness. But what about all the times I've been angry? Harry asked. All the times I've wanted to hurt people, or felt that pull toward power? You mean like every other human being who's ever lived? Hermione replied gently. Harry, anger and ambition aren't inherently evil. They're normal human emotions. The question isn't whether you've felt them, it's what you've chosen to do with them. And you've always chosen to do the right thing, Ron added, even when it was hard, even when it cost you something. Harry felt something ease slightly in his chest, a small loosening of the panic that had gripped him since reading Dumbledore's entry. His friend's unwavering support was like a lifeline thrown to a drowning man, giving him something to hold on to in the storm of self-doubt and fear. But even as he began to accept that he might still be fundamentally himself, despite carrying Voldemort's soul fragment, another realization was taking shape in his mind, something that made his previous horror seem almost trivial by comparison. There's something else, he said quietly. Something worse than just being a Horcrux. Ron and Hermione exchanged glances, both clearly steeling themselves for another revelation. What is it? Hermione asked. If I'm a Horcrux, Harry said, his voice steady, despite the enormity of what he was about to articulate, then Voldemort can't be completely destroyed as long as I'm alive. The piece of his soul inside me will keep him tethered to life, will allow him to return, no matter how many times he's defeated. So we find a way to remove it, Ron said immediately. We research soul magic, find some way to separate his soul fragment from yours without hurting you. I don't think that's possible, Harry replied, thinking of all the reading he'd done about Horcruxes in Dumbledore's lessons. Creating a Horcrux tears the soul. Removing one, I think it requires the destruction of the vessel that contains it. The words hung in the air between them, heavy with implication. Hermione's face had gone pale again, and Ron looked like he'd been punched in the stomach. No, Hermione said firmly. No, there has to be another way. There's always another way. Is there? Harry asked. Or is that just what we tell ourselves because we can't accept the truth? Dumbledore's been researching this for years, Hermione. He's looked at every possible option, explored every alternative, and according to his private notes, there's only one solution. I have to die. Dumbledore's not infallible, Ron said fiercely. Just because he can't find another way doesn't mean one doesn't exist. But what if he's right? Harry asked quietly. What if my death really is the only way to ensure that Voldemort can never return? What if every day I stay alive, I'm putting everyone else at risk? Then we take that risk, Hermione said, without hesitation. Harry, you're not responsible for fixing every problem in the wizarding world. You're not obligated to sacrifice yourself just because it might make things easier for everyone else. But if people die because I was too selfish to do what needed to be done, Then that's not your fault, Ron interrupted. That's Voldemort's fault, and it's the fault of every person who chose to follow him. You didn't ask to be made into a Horcrux, Harry. You didn't choose to have your life tied to his, and you shouldn't have to pay for his crimes with your death. Harry looked back and forth between his friends, seeing the fierce loyalty in their faces, the absolute refusal to accept his planned sacrifice as inevitable. Part of him was grateful for their support, but another part, the part that had been shaped by 16 years of being told he was responsible for everyone's safety, struggled against their arguments. "But if there really is no other way," he began. "Then we'll find one," Hermione said firmly. "Harry, you said Dobby has been researching alternative methods. House elf magic is different from wizard magic, older and more fundamental. Maybe he'll find something that Dumbledore missed." "And even if he doesn't," Ron added, "that doesn't mean we stop looking. There are other magical traditions, other forms of magic that exist outside what we're taught at Hogwarts. We'll explore every possibility before we even consider accepting that your death is inevitable." "Why?" Harry asked, his voice breaking slightly. "Why are you both so determined to save someone who might not be worth saving? Someone who's been corrupted by Voldemort's soul for 16 years? "Because you're our friend," Hermione said simply. "Because we love you. Because your life has value that has nothing to do with your usefulness in defeating Voldemort or your role in anyone else's plans. And because," Ron added with a slight smile, "you're the best person we know. If carrying a piece of Voldemort's soul for 16 years hasn't managed to corrupt you, then I reckon you're pretty much corruption-proof." Despite everything, Harry felt himself smile in response. It was a small thing, barely a ghost of his usual expression, but it felt like the first genuine emotion he'd experienced since reading Dumbledore's journal entry. "I'm scared," he admitted quietly. "Not just of dying, but of not knowing who I really am, of not being able to trust my own thoughts and feelings." "That's normal," Hermione said gently. "Anyone would be scared after learning something like this. But Harry, you've been yourself for 17 years. This revelation doesn't change who you are. It just gives you more information about the challenges you've faced and overcome. And you're not alone in figuring it out," Ron added. "We're here, and we're not going anywhere. Whatever you're dealing with, whatever you're feeling, we'll help you work through it." Harry nodded, feeling the tight knot of panic in his chest begin to loosen. He was still terrified, still struggling to process the implications of what he'd learned, but his friend's unwavering support gave him something to hold on to. "We should tell Sirius," he said finally. "And Remus. They deserve to know what Dumbledore has been planning, why he's been so determined to keep me isolated and dependent." "Are you ready for that conversation?" Hermione asked carefully. "Because they're going to be furious. Not at you," she added quickly, "but at the situation. At Dumbledore for keeping this secret and for planning to let you die without exploring every alternative." "I don't know if I'll ever be ready," Harry admitted, "but they need to know. And maybe they'll have ideas that we haven't considered, different perspectives on how to approach the problem." They spent the next hour discussing logistics, how to contact Sirius safely, what information to share, how to coordinate their efforts without alerting Dumbledore to their activities. By the time other students began filtering down from the dormitories for breakfast, they had the outline of a plan. But underneath the practical considerations, Harry was still grappling with the fundamental question of identity that had been raised by his discovery. If he was part Voldemort, if a fragment of the Dark Lord's soul had been influencing his thoughts and choices for 16 years, then who was he really? What parts of his personality were genuinely his, and what parts were the product of an internal struggle he'd never consciously recognized? The questions would have driven him mad, if not for the steady presence of his friends, their absolute conviction that he was still himself, regardless of what else might be sharing space in his head. Their faith in him was like an anchor, keeping him grounded when everything else felt like it was spinning out of control. As they made their way to the great hall for breakfast, Harry caught sight of Dumbledore at the staff table. The headmaster's eyes met his across the hall, and Harry thought he saw a flicker of something, concern, perhaps, or suspicion, in that familiar, twinkling gaze. Did he know? Had Dumbledore somehow sensed that Harry had learned the truth about what he was, about what fate had been planned for him? Harry looked away quickly, focusing on his plate and the mundane business of eating breakfast. But he could feel Dumbledore's attention on him like a weight, a reminder that the careful game they'd been playing was drawing to a close. Soon, very soon, there would be a reckoning. All the secrets would come out, all the lies would be exposed, and everyone would have to choose which side of the conflict they supported. Harry just hoped that when that moment came, he would have some idea of who he really was underneath the labels and expectations that others had placed on him. Because, for the first time in his life, he wasn't sure he could trust his own sense of self. The boy who lived had discovered he was also the boy who carried death inside him. Now he had to figure out whether those two identities could coexist or whether one would ultimately consume the other. The answer might determine not just his own fate, but the fate of everyone he cared about. Confrontation. The summons came on a Friday evening in February, delivered by Professor McGonagall with an expression that managed to convey both professional duty and personal concern. "The headmaster requests your presence in his office, Potter," she said quietly, her voice carefully neutral, despite the tension Harry could see around her eyes. 8 o'clock tonight. Harry looked up from his defense against the dark arts essay, his stomach clenching with a mixture of anticipation and dread. He had been expecting this moment for weeks, ever since Dobby had reported that Dumbledore was growing increasingly suspicious about missing documents and unusual student behavior. The careful game they'd been playing, Harry gathering allies while Dumbledore investigated the breach of his privacy, had finally reached its inevitable conclusion. "Did he say what this was about?" Harry asked, though he was fairly certain he already knew. "He did not," McGonagall replied, but her eyes flickered toward Dumbledore's journal, which lay concealed beneath Harry's Transfiguration textbook. The message was clear. It was time. Around them, the common room buzzed with its usual Friday evening energy, students completing weekend assignments, playing wizard's chess, gossiping about the latest romantic entanglements, and Quidditch rivalries. The normalcy of it all felt surreal, like watching life continue around him, while he prepared to step into a battle that would determine his future. "I'll be there," Harry said, his voice steady despite the rapid beating of his heart. McGonagall nodded once, then leaned slightly closer, as if adjusting something on the nearby bookshelf. "You needn't face this alone," she murmured, so quietly that only Harry could hear. "Some of us remember that our first loyalty should be to our students." As she walked away, Harry felt a warm surge of gratitude. McGonagall's words weren't just reassurance, they were a promise. When he walked into Dumbledore's office tonight, he wouldn't be the isolated, manipulated child that Dumbledore expected. He would have allies, people who had chosen to stand with him, despite the personal cost. The next few hours passed in a blur of preparation and nervous energy. Harry sent careful messages to Sirius and Remus, using the communication mirrors that his godfather had given him, and trusting that they would understand the coded language he'd developed over weeks of secret correspondence. He spoke quietly with Ron and Hermione, sharing final preparations and contingency plans. He even managed a brief, whispered conversation with Dobby, who promised to be nearby in case his unique abilities were needed. As 8 o'clock approached, Harry made his way through the castle corridors with a sense of destiny settling around him like a cloak. This was the moment everything had been building toward, the confrontation that would finally force Dumbledore to face the consequences of his manipulations. The gargoyle guarding the entrance to the headmaster's office recognized him, as it always did, stepping aside without requiring a password. Harry climbed the spiral staircase slowly, using the time to center himself, to remember everything he'd learned and everyone who supported him. By the time he reached the oak door at the top, his nerves had settled into something closer to calm determination. He knocked once, heard Dumbledore's familiar invitation to enter, and stepped into the circular office that had once represented wisdom and safety, but now felt more like the scene of a long-overdue reckoning. Dumbledore sat behind his massive desk, his hands folded calmly in front of him, and his blue eyes holding the kind of gentle concern that had once made Harry feel protected and valued. But now Harry could see the calculation behind that expression, the careful presentation of grandfatherly warmth designed to maintain control over a potentially volatile situation. "Harry," Dumbledore said, his voice carrying its usual notes of affection and mild worry. "Please sit. I believe we have some important matters to discuss." Harry remained standing, his hand resting lightly on the back of the chair Dumbledore had indicated. "I think we do," he agreed, his tone polite, but lacking the deference that Dumbledore had come to expect from him. "I confess," Dumbledore continued, seemingly unperturbed by Harry's refusal to sit, "that I've been concerned about you lately. Several of your professors have mentioned changes in your demeanor, a tendency toward questioning that wasn't present before the holidays. I wonder if perhaps something happened during your time away from school." The question was delicately posed, but Harry heard the trap within it. Dumbledore was fishing for information, trying to determine what Harry knew and how he'd learned it. It was exactly the kind of manipulative probing that Harry had grown to recognize and despise. "You could say that," Harry replied. "I learned some things about myself that no one had bothered to tell me. Important things that rather change one's perspective on life." "I see." Dumbledore's eyes sharpened almost imperceptibly. "And what sorts of things might those be?" Before Harry could answer, the fireplace flared green, and Sirius Black stepped through, his face grim with purpose and his wand held loosely, but ready in his right hand. He was followed immediately by Remus Lupin, who looked older and more careworn than Harry had ever seen him, and then by Professor Snape, whose black eyes held a cold fury that seemed to fill the room with tension. "Harry asked us to be here," Sirius said, without preamble, his gaze fixed on Dumbledore with an intensity that made the air crackle with suppressed magic. He thought this conversation might benefit from some adult perspective. Dumbledore's carefully composed expression flickered for just a moment, surprise and something that might have been alarm crossing his features before the mask of benevolent authority reasserted itself. "Sirius, Remus, Severus," he said, inclining his head in acknowledgement. "While I appreciate your concern for Harry's welfare, I believe this is a matter that would be better discussed privately, between myself and my student." "Your student," Snape repeated, his voice dripping with contempt. "How interesting that you choose that particular phrase. Not the boy you've been manipulating since birth. Not the child you've raised to sacrifice himself for your vision of the greater good. Just your student, as if he were nothing more than another name in your attendance records." The temperature in the room seemed to drop several degrees as Snape's words hung in the air. Dumbledore's blue eyes moved from Snape to Sirius to Remus, clearly recognizing that this was not going to be the quiet, controlled conversation he had planned. "I think," Harry said quietly, "that Professor Snape has raised some excellent points. Perhaps we should discuss exactly what kind of teacher-student relationship we've had, Professor Dumbledore, and whether it's been based on education or manipulation." Dumbledore was silent for a long moment, his gaze returning to Harry with something that might have been genuine sadness. "Harry," he said finally, his voice heavy with the weight of years and difficult choices, "I fear that someone has filled your head with ideas that are both dangerous and fundamentally mistaken. Whatever you think you've learned about my motivations or my methods, I assure you that everything I have ever done has been for your protection and the greater good of our world." "Really?" Harry asked, and his voice carried a steel that made everyone in the room look at him more carefully. Everything you've done has been for my protection, including arranging for me to be placed with relatives who starved me, locked me in a cupboard, and told me I was worthless, including intercepting my Hogwarts letters to control exactly when and how I learned of my magical heritage, including planning my willing death without ever bothering to inform me that I was expected to die for your cause. The accusations hit the room like physical blows. Dumbledore's face went pale, and even his carefully maintained composure couldn't quite hide the shock in his eyes. "Harry," he said carefully, "where did you—" "From your own hand," Harry interrupted, pulling Dumbledore's leather-bound journal from his robes and setting it on the desk between them. "Your private journal, Professor. Your own thoughts and plans, written in your own words. 17 years of careful manipulation and calculated cruelty, all justified by your certainty that you knew what was best for everyone." Dumbledore stared at the journal as if it were a snake that might strike at any moment. When he looked up, his eyes held a hardness that Harry had never seen before, the mask of grandfatherly concern finally beginning to crack. "That journal contains private thoughts and preliminary plans," Dumbledore said, his voice cooler now. "Speculation and contingencies that were never meant to be taken as final decisions. You cannot judge the complexity of the situation based on incomplete information." "Incomplete!" Sirius snarled, stepping forward with barely restrained fury. "Albus, I've read that journal, every word of it. I've seen how you documented my godson's suffering as if it were a fascinating experiment. How you planned to keep us apart because my love for him might interfere with your plans for his death. How you justified 17 years of abuse and isolation as character building. You don't understand," Dumbledore said, and for the first time his voice held a note of desperation. "None of you understand the impossible position I was placed in. The prophecy that you've never let Harry hear in its entirety," Remus asked, his quiet voice carrying more menace than Sirius's open anger. "The prophecy that you've interpreted to suit your own purposes without consulting the person it supposedly concerns. The prophecy that marks either Harry or Voldemort for death," Dumbledore said firmly. "The prophecy that makes Harry's sacrifice not just necessary, but inevitable." "Inevitable according to your interpretation," Snape said coldly. "But prophecies are notoriously unreliable, Albus. They depend on interpretation, on the choices made by those they concern. You chose to interpret it as requiring Potter's death, because that interpretation served your strategic goals." "And what would you have had me do, Severus?" Dumbledore asked, his voice rising for the first time. "What other interpretation serves the cause of protecting innocent lives?" "How about the interpretation that says Harry might defeat Voldemort and live?" Harry suggested, his voice cutting through the argument with quiet intensity. "How about considering that neither can live while the other survives might mean something other than one of us has to die? How about actually consulting the person the prophecy is about instead of making decisions for him?" Dumbledore turned back to Harry, and for a moment the old man looked genuinely pained. "Harry," he said gently, "you are 17 years old. You haven't lived long enough to understand the weight of the choices that must be made in times like these. The burden of leadership requires accepting terrible responsibilities, making decisions that cause pain but serve the greater good." "Don't," Harry said, his voice sharp with anger. "Don't you dare patronize me now. Don't you dare tell me I'm too young to understand when you've spent 17 years manipulating my entire life based on your understanding. Don't you dare claim this is about leadership when it's really about control. You think I wanted this?" Dumbledore asked, his voice breaking slightly. "You think I enjoyed planning the sacrifice of a child I have watched grow up, have come to care for deeply? I think," Harry said carefully, "that you convinced yourself it was necessary because it was easier than admitting you might be wrong. I think you told yourself you were protecting me while you were really protecting your own vision of how the war should end. And I think you've been lying to yourself for so long that you actually believe your own justifications." The words hit Dumbledore like a slap. He recoiled slightly, his hands gripping the edge of his desk as if to steady himself. "That is not—" he began. "True?" Snape interrupted. "Then explain to me, Albus, why you used my guilt over Lily's death to ensure my cooperation with your plans. Why you allowed me to believe I was helping to protect her son when I was actually helping to prepare him for slaughter." Dumbledore's gaze moved to Snape, and for the first time since Harry had known him, the headmaster looked truly defensive. "Severus, you know how much I value your—" "My guilt," Snape finished brutally. "My self-hatred, my willingness to do anything, no matter how morally questionable, if I believed it would somehow atone for my failures. You didn't value my friendship, Albus. You valued my usefulness." "That is not true," Dumbledore said, but his voice lacked conviction. "Isn't it?" Remus asked quietly. "Because when I read that journal, Albus, I saw very similar calculations about my usefulness, my grief over James and Lily's deaths, my guilt over my condition and the isolation it created, my gratitude for your acceptance and employment, all of it carefully noted and leveraged to ensure my compliance with plans I was never fully informed about." The room fell silent, except for the soft ticking of the various magical instruments scattered around Dumbledore's office. The headmaster looked around at the faces surrounding him. Harry's controlled anger, Sirius's barely restrained fury, Remus's quiet disappointment, Snape's cold contempt, and for the first time in Harry's memory, Albus Dumbledore looked old and uncertain. "You don't understand," he said again, but this time the words sounded hollow even to him. "Then explain it to us," Harry said. "Make us understand why my life is worth less than everyone else's. Make us understand why my death is inevitable, when you haven't even tried to find alternatives. Make us understand why you have the right to plan my future without my consent." Dumbledore was quiet for a long moment, his blue eyes distant, as if he were seeing something beyond the walls of his office. When he finally spoke, his voice was heavy with exhaustion. "Because the alternative is the death of millions," he said simply. "Because every day that Voldemort remains capable of returning, innocent people die. Because sometimes, Harry, one life must be sacrificed to save many." "But that's not your choice to make," Harry said fiercely. "It's mine. My life, my choice, my decision about what I'm willing to sacrifice and what I'm not. You don't get to decide that my death is acceptable just because it serves your strategic goals." "You are a child," Dumbledore said, and this time there was no gentleness in his voice. "You cannot possibly understand the complexity of the situation, the weight of the choices that must be made. I have lived for over a century, Harry. I have seen wars, studied prophecies, faced dark wizards that you cannot even imagine. I have the experience and wisdom necessary to make these decisions. And yet," Sirius said, his voice dangerous, "you somehow missed the possibility that there might be other ways to defeat Voldemort. You somehow failed to consider that your interpretation of the prophecy might be wrong. You somehow neglected to research alternatives to Harry's death, despite having access to magical knowledge that most wizards can only dream of." "There are no alternatives," Dumbledore said firmly. "I have researched every possibility, explored every avenue. The connection between Harry and Voldemort, the Horcrux that lives within him." "The what?" Sirius interrupted sharply. Harry closed his eyes briefly, realizing that in his anger, Dumbledore had revealed something that Harry hadn't yet shared with his godfather. "Harry is an accidental Horcrux," Dumbledore said, seeming to recognize that the secret was already out. "The night Voldemort tried to kill him, a fragment of the Dark Lord's soul attached itself to Harry. As long as that fragment remains, Voldemort cannot truly die." And removing it requires destroying the vessel that contains it, Harry finished. Requires my death. Or so you've concluded, without consulting me or anyone else who might have different ideas about how to approach the problem. Sirius looked stricken, his face going pale as the implications hit him. Harry, he said quietly, why didn't you tell me? Because I was still processing it myself, Harry replied. Because I was trying to figure out who I really am when part of me is Voldemort. Because I was hoping that someone with more experience and wisdom might have ideas about how to separate his soul from mine without killing me in the process. There is no way, Dumbledore said with finality. Harry, I know this is difficult to accept, but the creation of a Horcrux tears the soul. Removing one requires the complete destruction of the vessel. There is no magical procedure, no spell or potion or ritual that can safely separate Voldemort's soul fragment from your own. Have you actually researched that? Remus asked carefully. Have you consulted other magical traditions, other forms of magic that might approach the problem differently? I have consulted every text, every expert, every possible source of information, Dumbledore replied. There is no alternative to Harry's willing sacrifice. Bullshit, a new voice said from the fireplace. Everyone turned to see Professor McGonagall stepping through the flames, her lips pressed into a thin line and her eyes blazing with anger. She was followed by Hagrid, who looked like he was struggling not to cry, and then by Dobby, whose large eyes were bright with fierce determination. Minerva, Dumbledore said, and for the first time he sounded truly rattled. This is not appropriate, professional, the kind of conversation you wanted to have with your colleagues present? McGonagall asked sharply. Too bad, Albus, because we've all heard enough whispered rumors and seen enough inconsistencies to know that something was very wrong with how you've been handling Harry's situation. And after Professor Snape shared some of the contents of your journal with us, we decided it was time for some accountability. You have no right, Dumbledore began, his voice rising. No right? Hagrid rumbled, his voice thick with emotion. No right to care about a student we've watched grow up? No right to question decisions made in his name without his knowledge? No right to demand answers when we discover that one of our own has been planned for sacrifice like some sort of ancient ritual? We do have a right, McGonagall said firmly. The right of teachers who are supposed to protect our students, not prepare them for slaughter. The right of colleagues who were kept in the dark about decisions that affected our work and our responsibilities. The right of human beings who refuse to accept that a 17-year-old boy is expendable for anyone's vision of the greater good. Dumbledore looked around the room again, seeing the united front that had formed against him, the absolute refusal of everyone present to accept his authority as final. You don't understand what's at stake, he said desperately. The prophecy is clear. The prophecy is vague, poetic language that could be interpreted a dozen different ways, Snape said coldly. You chose the interpretation that justified the strategy you wanted to pursue, Albus. You didn't find the strategy in the prophecy. You found the prophecy to support your strategy. And even if your interpretation is correct, Dobby said, speaking for the first time since entering the office. Even if Harry Potter must face Voldemort in final battle, that does not mean Harry Potter must die. There are other kinds of magic, other traditions, other ways of approaching soul magic that wizards have forgotten or never learned. Dumbledore's eyes fixed on Dobby with something approaching shock. You're suggesting house elf magic could solve this problem? Dobby is suggesting that Professor Dumbledore has not explored every possibility, the elf replied firmly, has not consulted other magical beings, has not considered that his knowledge might be incomplete. House elves know old magic, deep magic, magic that does not require wands or formal training. Dobby has spoken with other elves, elves whose families served magical households for centuries. There are stories, legends, techniques for purifying corrupted souls that do not require destroying the host. Stories, Dumbledore said dismissively. Legends. Folklore without basis in In the kind of magic you consider legitimate? McGonagall asked sharply. Albus, you've just admitted that you're willing to sacrifice a child based on your interpretation of a prophecy. But you won't even investigate alternatives because they come from magical traditions you don't respect? It's not about respect, Dumbledore said, his voice strained. It's about proven, documented magical theory. House elf magic is powerful, yes, but it's not designed for the kind of complex soul work required to separate a Horcrux from its host. How do you know? Harry asked quietly. Have you studied house elf magic? Have you learned their techniques, consulted their traditions, explored their understanding of soul magic? Or did you just assume that because it's different from wizard magic, it must be inferior? Dumbledore opened his mouth to respond, then closed it again, seeming to recognize the trap in Harry's question. I thought not, Harry continued. You've spent 17 years planning my death without ever seriously investigating whether there might be ways to keep me alive. You've convinced yourself that my sacrifice is inevitable because it was easier than admitting you might not know everything. That is not, Dumbledore began. True? Sirius interrupted. Then prove it. Let Dobby research his traditions. Let other magical beings contribute their knowledge. Let Harry be part of the conversation about his own fate. Stop making decisions for him and start making decisions with him. And if the research fails, Dumbledore asked, if there truly is no alternative to Harry's sacrifice, will you accept that some prices must be paid for victory? If, and only if, we explore every genuine alternative and find that Harry's death is truly the only way to defeat Voldemort, then that will be Harry's decision to make, McGonagall said firmly. Not yours, not ours, but his. And whatever he chooses, we'll support him and do everything in our power to find ways to honor his choice while minimizing the cost. But we're not there yet, Remus added. We're not even close to being there, because you've been so focused on planning Harry's willing sacrifice that you've never seriously investigated whether it's actually necessary. Dumbledore was quiet for a long moment, looking older and more defeated than Harry had ever seen him. The carefully maintained facade of wise leadership had cracked completely, revealing something smaller and more human underneath. You think this has been easy for me? He asked finally, his voice barely above a whisper. You think I've enjoyed planning the death of a child I've watched grow up? Every day, every decision, every manipulation has been agony. But sometimes leadership requires accepting terrible responsibilities. No, Harry said firmly. Leadership requires making difficult decisions based on complete information and consultation with the people those decisions affect. What you've been doing isn't leadership, Professor. It's playing God with other people's lives. The words hung in the air like a final judgment. Dumbledore flinched, as if Harry had struck him, his hands trembling slightly as he gripped the edge of his desk. I have done what I believed was necessary, he said, but his voice lacked any conviction. Without consulting the person most affected by your decisions, Harry replied, without exploring alternatives that might challenge your assumptions, without considering that maybe, just maybe, you might be wrong. And now, McGonagall said, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had reached the end of her patience, you're going to step back and let other people contribute to finding solutions. You're going to stop making decisions about Harry's life without his input. And you're going to start remembering that your job is to educate and protect students, not to sacrifice them for strategic advantage. Dumbledore looked around the room one more time, seeing the unified opposition to his methods, the absolute refusal to accept his authority as final. When his gaze finally returned to Harry, there was something like recognition in his eyes, an acknowledgement that the boy he had tried to shape and control had grown beyond his influence. Very well, he said quietly. We will explore alternatives, research other approaches, include Harry in discussions about his own future. It wasn't an apology, and it wasn't a complete capitulation, but it was an acknowledgement that the old order had changed, that Harry was no longer the manipulated child that Dumbledore could guide toward a predetermined fate. As they prepared to leave the office, Harry felt something shift inside him, a sense of weight lifted and agency reclaimed. He was still a Horcrux, still faced an uncertain future in the war against Voldemort, but for the first time in his life, that future felt like it truly belonged to him. The boy who lived was no longer content to be the boy who was meant to die. And everyone in that room, including Dumbledore himself, finally understood that everything had changed. Institutional reckoning. The emergency meeting of the Hogwarts Board of Governors was called for 9 o'clock on a Saturday morning, less than 12 hours after the confrontation in Dumbledore's office. Harry sat in the anteroom outside the board chamber, his hands folded calmly in his lap, despite the magnitude of what was about to unfold. Beside him, Professor McGonagall reviewed her notes one final time, her expression stern with professional determination. "Are you ready for this?" she asked quietly, her voice carrying both concern and admiration for the young man who had become the center of a revolution he never asked for. "I've been ready for this my entire life," Harry replied, and realized as he said it that it was true. Every manipulation, every lie, every moment of being treated as a thing rather than a person had been preparing him for this moment when he would finally stand before the Wizarding World's authorities and demand to be seen as a human being with inherent worth and agency. The chamber doors opened, and Augusta Longbottom emerged, her face grave with the weight of what she'd just heard. As the current chair of the Board of Governors, she had listened to 3 hours of testimony from Harry's allies, had reviewed every page of Dumbledore's journal, had confronted evidence of systematic manipulation that challenged everything she thought she knew about the man who had led magical Britain for decades. "Mr. Potter," she said formally, "the board is ready to hear your statement." Harry rose and walked into the chamber with his head held high. The 12 members of the Board of Governors sat behind a curved table that dominated the room, their faces showing various combinations of shock, anger, and careful neutrality. Some of them had clearly been crying. Others looked like they were struggling to maintain their composure in the face of revelations that shook the foundation of their understanding of recent history. At the center of the table sat an empty chair, Dumbledore's seat, vacant now pending the board's decision about his future as headmaster. The symbolism wasn't lost on anyone present. "Mr. Potter," Augusta Longbottom said, her voice carrying the formal gravity appropriate to the moment. "You have accused Albus Dumbledore of systematic manipulation, child abuse, and planning your death without your consent. The board has reviewed the evidence you've provided through your representatives. Now we'd like to hear from you directly about how these actions have affected your life and your education." Harry looked around the room, taking in the faces of the men and women who held ultimate authority over Hogwarts, who had the power to hold Dumbledore accountable for his actions. These were people who had known him since he was 11, who had watched him grow up through newspaper articles and school reports, who had seen him celebrated as the boy who lived without ever understanding what that designation had cost him. "Honorable Governors," Harry began, his voice steady and clear, "I want to start by saying that I'm not here seeking revenge against Professor Dumbledore. I'm not here because I hate him or want to see him punished for the sake of punishment. I'm here because I believe that children, all children, including famous ones, have the right to know the truth about their own lives and to have a say in decisions that affect their futures." He paused, letting that principle settle in the room before continuing. "For 17 years, Professor Dumbledore has made choices about my life without consulting me. He decided where I would live, knowing that my relatives would abuse and neglect me. He decided when and how I would learn about my magical heritage. He decided which friendships I would be encouraged to form and which relationships would be discouraged. He decided that my education would focus on preparing me for willing self-sacrifice, rather than teaching me to value my own life and seek alternatives to martyrdom. The room was silent, except for the soft scratching of quills as the court reporter documented every word. The evidence you've reviewed shows that Professor Dumbledore knew about my mistreatment at the hands of my relatives and chose not to intervene because he believed suffering would make me more willing to die for his cause. It shows that he orchestrated my introduction to the magical world to create emotional dependency. It shows that he interpreted prophecy in ways that justified his predetermined strategy, rather than exploring other possible meanings. Harry's voice remained calm, but there was steel beneath the surface that made several board members shift uncomfortably.